joined by Grace Chase, who once was debased but embraced her space when her self-proclaimed sustained faith erased and replaced that disgrace-shaped face without a trace. Now Grace, what are you going to be selling us today?
Thank you so much for having me on your show today. It's been a journey. I was born without a body, abandoned in a Little Caesars bathroom, and raised in the mean streets of the New York City subway system. My only guardian was a subway rat who taught me how to read by using discarded Metro cards. By the age of 7, I was selling my blood to the Times Square Elmo just to buy dollar slices. By 9, I had died and gone to heaven twice. Yes, it's real. But don't feel bad for me. All of that's behind me now. I've forgiven my mother. I've forgiven the rat. I've even forgiven myself. Now I'm a thriving, productive member of society with a Rolodex. Sometimes I cry while staring beautifully out of Rain Street windows, but never during conference calls. And you can overcome your trauma too. Find out how in my new memoir, A Million Little Pizzas, From Crust to Trust, available for $24.99 or $34.99 wherever audiobooks are sold. I do yoga every morning and still make it to work on time. What's your excuse?
So it's January 2006, and a 36-year-old former alcoholic named James Frey is having the worst day of his life. He's sitting across from Oprah Winfrey, the woman who made him a millionaire, and she's destroying him on national television. "I feel duped," she says. "I feel that you betrayed millions of readers." 4 months earlier, Oprah had selected Frey's memoir, A Million Little Pieces, for her book club. It was this absolutely visceral account of addiction and recovery, 87 days in jail, root canals without anesthesia, a doomed romance with a fellow patient named Lily who would die while Frey was locked up and helpless to reach her. He'd even written about the death of his only childhood friend, a girl killed when a car was hit by a train, whose parents blamed Frey for her death because he'd helped her sneak out that night. The book was completely unflinching. It was cinematic, redemptive even. It sold 3.5 million copies and became the recovery movement's Bible. And then investigators at the Smoking Gun website spent 6 weeks fact-checking Frey's story. Those 87 days in jail were really 5 hours. The root canal without painkillers never happened. Lily probably never existed. 2 girls from his hometown really were killed by a train, but Frey had no known connection to either of them, certainly no friendship or parental blame. The mother of one of the girls told the Smoking Gun she had no idea who he was. Frey had taken her real death and rewritten himself into it as the grieving witness to a death he never saw. Frey's book wasn't unique in either its popularity or its dramatism. If you walked into any bookstore between 1995 and 2010, you'd notice entire walls dedicated to what the industry cheerfully called misery lit. The covers looked mostly identical. A child's face in soft focus, maybe a shadowy adult figure looming, always that same cursive font that looked like tears might drip off the letters. The titles were often very direct. Please Daddy No, Cry Silent Tears, Damaged, just damaged. Waterstones had a whole section labeled Painful Lives. Borders called theirs Real Lives, as opposed to all that other presumably less real nonfiction. W.H. Smith, apparently done with euphemisms, just went with tragic life stories, and they were everywhere. In the UK, the numbers were staggering. By 2006, trauma memoirs made up 11 of the UK's top 100 paperback bestsellers. Publishers couldn't print them fast enough. In the US too, trauma memoirs dominated bestseller lists throughout the aughts, some of which sold millions of copies. And then, just as immediately as it appeared, the whole misery business collapsed. By 2010, those Painful Lives sections had disappeared. The misery memoir gold rush was over. Publishers moved on to the next trend, and sad children got replaced with hot vampires. But between the rise and fall of misery lit, something deeply fucked up happened to how we tell stories about trauma. So first things first, let me tell you about some people's actual published life stories from that era, and you can take a second to guess whether they're telling the truth. First up, a young woman grows up in foster care in South Central LA, navigating gang culture as a half-white, half-Native American kid trying to survive. She sells drugs, sees friends murdered, and barely escapes with her life. She publishes her memoir in 2008. The New York Times calls it humane, deeply affecting, and redemptive. That's Margaret B. Jones's Love and Consequences. In fact, Margaret B. Jones was actually Margaret Seltzer, a 33-year-old white woman who grew up in Sherman Oaks and went to private school. She had nothing to do with gangs, she just lied. During radio interviews, she spoke in a fake accent and called her alleged gang friends homies.
On that day, that was the day the big homie got shot.
As in, your OG Craziac.
Yeah, I'll read a passage from the book. It says, one of the OGs went by the name of Craziac. everything's true. It's just, let's say, like the scene where I went to the grocery store with my little sisters, there was more like, instead of 3 of us, there was 5 of us. But I sort of combined them into one person.
Her editor worked with her for 3 years, during which Seltzer complained about having no money or heat. When the truth came out, she defended herself by implying that she was amplifying marginalized voices. Another one. A woman from Jordan writes about her best friend Dahlia, who falls in love with a Christian soldier. They keep it secret from Dahlia's Muslim family, but when he finds out, he stabs his daughter to death. The author flees to America to tell the story. This was Forbidden Love by Norma Corey, published in 2003. It sold over 200,000 copies worldwide.
Do you have some hope that it will change?
I think it will change if we get enough people involved. We need the international community to be the voice for these women.
And then it turned out Norma hadn't lived in Jordan since she was 3. She'd been in Chicago running real estate scams with her American husband. Dahlia never existed, the honor killing never happened. When confronted, Corey insisted she was protecting real people by fictionalizing details. All of the details, apparently.
The person who wrote the book obviously has some knowledge of the hospital, but then she goes on to say, when we got into the elevator to go to the basement of the old hospital, we pass by our elevator, it goes up. We don't have a basement.
But as soon as Norma's name started popping up again in Chicago, I started getting calls after the first story ran from folks saying, I know Norma and she scammed me too.
A boy in a concentration camp meets a girl who throws him apples over the fence, saving his life. Years later, they meet on a blind date in America and realize they're destined to be together. Atlantic Overseas Pictures buys the rights to a movie for $25 million. Oprah calls it the single greatest love story she's ever heard. Yeah, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by asking you to guess this one. Herman Rosenblatt's Angel at the Fence was scheduled for publication in 2009, by which point the boy in the striped pajamas had already spent 2 years teaching millions of readers what a concentration camp fence looked like. In fact, scholars pointed out that Rosenblatt's story was physically impossible. The fence at Schlieben wasn't approachable from either side, and the only public road near the camp had been closed to civilians since 1943. Though he really was a Holocaust survivor, the girl with the apples was a complete fiction. He met his wife on a regular blind date in Brooklyn. She had spent the war on a farm 200 miles away. All of these stories were published during the trauma memoir boom of the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. Why did these people all lie? Why didn't they just publish their shit as fiction? Well, some of them tried. 17 publishers rejected A Million Little Pieces when Frey's agent shopped it as fiction. Then someone, and accounts differ on who, suggested calling it a memoir instead. Suddenly Doubleday offered him a 6-figure deal. The book didn't change, not one word of it. The same sentences, the same scenes, the same emotions, the same characters. In theory, the experience of reading it was identical either way. What changed was a word on the back of a book. Novel became memoir, and that single reclassification was worth more than the entire book had been worth as fiction, which means the thing being purchased wasn't the prose or the story or the emotional experience. Those were all available in the fiction version and nobody wanted them. What was being purchased was the label, the assertion that this really happened. Everything else was packaging. Authenticity was the product, even if you had to invent it to get there. And invent it they did! During this gold rush era, one middle-aged woman writes 3 works of autofiction under the guise of being a teenage male sex worker. She even hires a body double to do interviews. The double hangs out with Winona Ryder and Bono. She gets away with it for years. Several works of nonfiction about life as a person of color end up getting exposed as being by white people who are just lying. People writing memoirs about their childhoods get sued by their parents based on the accusation that they lied. By 2008, false memoirs are getting exposed so regularly that the New Republic runs a piece called Cooked Books, wondering if really any memoir could be trusted. And then by 2010, the misery memoir industry has almost completely dried up, and seemingly for reasons completely unrelated to the fakery. A Million Little Pieces still sells pretty well to this day. What the hell happened? Why did millions of people suddenly need to read about the worst things that could happen to a child? What was it about this genre that fomented lying, seemingly more than any other genre? And why did it all stop so abruptly? It turns out this particular era of books has roots that stretch back decades further than anyone was selling them as, built on a therapeutic framework that put innocent people in prison, a cultural panic that consumed an entire decade, and a lot of Oprah. And the very same forces that propelled it into existence are still all around us, worming their way into our media ecosystem from pretty much every direction. You've probably already encountered them today. So we have our landscape, a decade-long gold rush of trauma memoirs, a disturbing number of which turned out to be fake. Publishers who couldn't print these books fast enough and apparently couldn't be convinced to fact-check them either. This started, like most gold rushes, with proof that there was gold to be found. Literary hoaxes have existed for centuries. What the late 20th century added was the apparatus of authentication, talk shows and other mass media, author photos, the true story as a marketing category. In 1995, a guy named Dave Pelzer published a book called A Child Called It through a small health communications press. You might have heard of it. It's about his childhood being tortured by his alcoholic mother. She made him eat from a dog bowl, held his arm over a gas stove, stabbed him, made him drink ammonia. The whole thing is written in this very simple, almost childlike voice, and it is absolutely brutal to read. The book didn't explode right away. It came out, it sold some copies, and then it kind of sat there for about 2 years, actually. What changed everything was television. In 1997, Pelzer appeared on The Montel Williams Show, then on Oprah, and this small press memoir became a phenomenon. According to one industry account, Pelzer was commanding a $7,000 appearance fee and doing 270 speaking presentations a year. A Child Called It appeared on the Times bestseller list for a combined 448 weeks, that's over 8 years, and sold 3.5 million copies in the UK alone, which, if my math is correct, means nearly 1 in 10 adults bought a copy. A quick note on Dave Pelzer, because I'm sure I'm going to get comments about this. People have been questioning the veracity of his books almost as long as the books have been out. The New York Times ran a piece called Dysfunction for Dollars in 2002. He's been accused of buying his own books in bulk to inflate their bestseller rankings. For a long time, he falsely claimed on his website to be nominated for a Pulitzer. Both of these, I think, are valid critiques of both Pelzer and the apparatus that turns trauma into profit. But I do think that's worth distinguishing from the critique that he made everything in his book up. I looked into this pretty substantially because after an entire video about mostly made-up memoirs, I felt primed to be skeptical. Parts of his second and third books I do share some doubts about. But as far as his first book is concerned, I read it in full, I researched what corroboration existed, and I didn't come out disbelieving that the abuse in A Child Called It happened. Dave was removed on March 5th, 1973 for neglect and abuse, and his former teacher has corroborated that too. He has a grandmother who called the books fiction, but wasn't living in the same state during the relevant period. One brother denies anything happened, and another independently corroborated the abuse and wrote his own memoir about becoming the next target after Dave was removed. He seems like a grifter is a personality critique, and I would argue it's even a fair one. But a personality type is not the same thing as a lie. The commercialization of the suffering and the reality of the suffering are two entirely separate questions, and I think it matters we keep them separate, especially in a video that's partly about how markets distort the stories survivors can tell. Pelzer's story is set in the early 1970s. He was removed from his home on March 5th, 1973 at age 12, and that date matters because the Federal Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, the law that created national standards for child protection, wasn't passed until January 1974, 10 months after his rescue. Pelzer's entire abuse period predates the existence of the American child protection system as we know it. In early 1970s California, teachers weren't mandated reporters. They had no legal duty to report, no training on identifying abuse, and also no clear definitions as to what abuse even was. The very concept of battered child syndrome had only been named in 1962. Before that, children with suspicious fractures were routinely incorrectly diagnosed with rare brittle bone diseases because the alternative was unthinkable. There's a scene in the book where a social worker visits the home. Pelzer's mother stages a reconciliation the day before, acts loving in front of the visitor, and young David lies to protect her. It reads as a story about a manipulative abuser outsmarting the system. But what was also happening is the fact that home visits in this era were announced in advance, giving families time to prepare. The social worker interviewed the child in front of the parent. This was standard practice at the time. And crucially, no one had a framework for understanding why an abused child would protect their abuser. Roland Summit's foundational research on that phenomenon wasn't published until 1983. The concept of traumatic bonding wasn't theorized until 1981. In 1973, a child denying abuse was interpreted as evidence the abuse didn't occur. The social worker in that scene wasn't necessarily incompetent. She was operating without tools that hadn't been invented yet. But the book can't focus on anything structural like that. It can only show you what a child saw, an adult who failed him. There's another book that could have been written, one that used Pelzer's story to explain why the United States needed federal child protection standards, one that traced how CAPTA was passed 10 months after his rescue and how mandatory reporting laws spread state by state, how the very frameworks for understanding child abuse were developed in the years following cases like his. That book would have been important. It might have helped readers understand why systems fail and what it takes to fix them. It would not have sold 3 million copies because it would have asked readers to think about policy instead of just feel. A Child Called It is written from a child's perspective in a child's voice. Here's a typical passage.
Inside, my soul became so cold I hated everything. I even despised the sun, for I knew I would never be able to play in its warm presence. I cringed with hate whenever I heard other children laughing as they played outside.
It puts you inside a child's experience of suffering, and that's what the book does very effectively. It generates empathy and makes you feel what this kid felt. But here's the thing about child narrators, they don't know about policy. A child narrator can show you teachers who failed, but he can't explain why the system made failure inevitable. He can show you a social worker who didn't help, but he can't tell you about the absence of mandated reporting laws or the lack of training protocols. The form itself forecloses systemic analysis. You get individual villains, his mother, the passive adults like his dad, and individual heroism when someone finally acts. The structural conditions that enabled years of abuse remain invisible because a child wouldn't know how to look for them. And that's fine. Dave Pelzer wrote his story. But what happened next is about the publishing industry, not about him. A Child Called It became a template. Publishers looked at the book and saw a formula: child voice, individual suffering, individual villain, redemption through personal resilience. They saw something that could be replicated, and they saw something that, crucially, made readers feel moved without making them feel implicated. A year after Pelzer, Frank McCourt published Angela's Ashes, also a childhood trauma memoir: Irish poverty, dead siblings, alcoholic father, grinding deprivation. McCourt was different. He'd spent decades as a creative writing teacher. He had literary connections. His book had this lyrical, darkly funny quality that made critics take it seriously as capital L literature. Scholar Sue Weiss argues that Angela's Ashes is actually the more important template for what came next, the book that made this form respectable. Pelzer proved you could sell trauma in supermarkets. McCourt proved you could win a Pulitzer for it. Angela's Ashes took that prize in 1997, got adapted into a movie, sold 10 million copies. So now the publishing industry had proof of concept in two directions: mass market and prestige. It was serious literature that also sold at Tesco. By the early 2000s, the publishing industry had consolidated into the Big Six massive conglomerates that controlled most of the market. And these conglomerates were increasingly focused on blockbuster potential. They didn't want to publish 10 books that each sold 50,000 copies. They wanted one book that sold 500,000. The mid-list was dying. Anything that couldn't be a hit wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. So why trauma memoirs? Why not celebrity memoirs or true crime or any of the other genres that could theoretically produce blockbusters? The answer, I think, is that trauma memoirs were structurally optimized for post-consolidation publishing economics in ways other genres weren't. Celebrity memoirs require paying celebrities. Trauma memoirs from unknown survivors cost almost nothing to acquire. The author typically has no pre-existing platform or leverage, and certainly no agent with a track record of extracting seven-figure advances. The power imbalance is enormous. True crime requires extensive verification and legal review. Trauma memoirs are self-verifying through the author's claimed experience. The author says it happened to them. Who's gonna check? Nobody, as it turned out. One of Pelzer's UK publishers later admitted, "Tacitly, we took the view that since the book had already sold millions in the US and Pelzer had appeared on Oprah, rigorous checking was not necessary." The True Story claim does your marketing for free. You don't need to build an author platform, the trauma is the platform. And daytime talk shows, which were both the primary marketing engine and commanded the primary book buying demographic, were desperate for this content. Oprah picks your book, you sell 1 million copies. The ecosystem was vertically integrated. Talk show to bookstore to supermarket checkout line, all selecting for the same emotional beats. And once you have a template that works, it's infinitely reproducible. This video is gonna keep coming back to one specific narrative structure: child voice, individual villain, suffering overcome through personal will, redemption at the end. To avoid repeating this constantly, I'm just gonna call this the template. Stories that fit the template got acquired, edited to emphasize these elements, marketed through channels optimized for emotional impact, including in some of the most serious, brutal settings imaginable. There's an older, more general term for what's happening here, and it comes from an unlikely source. A road trip story! In 1973, the Italian novelist Umberto Eco took a road trip across America where he visited wax museums and theme parks, and he came back with an observation about what American culture does to reality. He noticed that every reconstruction he saw was designed to be more vivid than the original. All of the reproductions were more colorful and detailed, and the more he saw of this, the more he realized this was actually the point. As he put it, the completely real becomes identified with the completely fake. Absolute unreality is offered as real presence. He called this hyperreality. That's the misery memoir market in a single sentence. It comes together when you realize these published memoirs aren't actually trying to represent reality. Rather, they're trying to replace it with something better, a more vivid and coherent and emotionally satisfying version of itself. And then that replacement became the new standard for what reality was supposed to look like. I would say within this framework, the template is like the manufacturing process by which real human suffering gets converted into hyper-real product. It takes the raw material, stuff which is messy, contradictory, often boring, full of systemic causes that are hard to photograph and institutional failures that don't fit on a book cover, and it refines it. What comes out the other end is suffering that's more. Suffering that's better than real. And if that logic holds, if what the market selects for is the most vivid of suffering, regardless of its relationship to what actually happened, then there's certainly no reason it would stop at addiction memoirs or ganglit. In 1995, the same year as A Child Called It, a Swiss musician publishing under the name Benjamin Wilkermiski released Fragments, a memoir of surviving the concentration camps as a child. The book depicted his alleged experience as a toddler in Majdanek and Auschwitz, rats eating corpses, guards smashing children's heads against walls, the constant terror of a child who doesn't understand why any of this is happening. Fragments won the National Jewish Book Award. It won the Prix Mémoire de la Shoah in France. It was translated into 12 languages and taught in schools. Critics praised it as a masterpiece of survivor testimony, comparing it to Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. The fragmentary, childlike prose style, disjointed, sensory, pre-verbal almost, was seen as an authentic representation of traumatic memory. 2 years after Fragments, Misha Defonseca published Misha, a memoir of the Holocaust years. It's about a young Jewish girl fleeing the Nazis, wandering across Europe on foot, and I need you to stay with me here, being adopted by a pack of wolves who protect her through the war. She also kills a German soldier in self-defense. The book sold well across Europe and got adapted into a French film called Surviving with the Wolves. In 2008, Defonseca admitted she made it all up. She wasn't even Jewish. Her real name was Monique de Wael, and she'd spent the war years in Brussels attending school. When confronted, she said the book was not actual reality, but was her reality. Wolves! In the summer of 1997, a woman calling herself Laura Grabowski showed up at the Child Holocaust Survivors Group of Los Angeles. She had an extraordinary story. She was a Polish Jewish orphan imprisoned at Auschwitz-Birkenau as a young child, a victim of Josef Mengelé's medical experiments. She said chemical injections had damaged her eyes and left her infertile. She claimed her distinctive white blonde hair had spared her from having her head shaved, which explained why she was unregistered and had no camp documentation. After liberation in 1945, she'd been sent to an orphanage in Krakow before being adopted by a Christian American couple and brought to Washington State. It was a moving story. People believed her. Jewish Family Services made 24 disbursements to her, totaling over $2,000. She filed claims with the World Jewish Restitution Organization and the Swiss Fund for Holocaust Victims. A friend she'd met through a Holocaust website sent her $1,000 for first-class airfare after Laura claimed her doctors required first-class travel due to her rare blood disorder. She'd survived Mengele, but apparently economy seating might finish the job. Laura Grabowski read Benjamin Wilkermiski's book Fragments and started corresponding with him. And they discovered that they had basically identical experiences. Same approximate age, both adopted by Christians, both claiming to be Mengele victims, both claiming rare blood disorders from the experiments, both claiming broken tailbones. Wilkermiski would claim to vividly remember Laura's white blonde hair from the camps. On Holocaust Remembrance Day 1998, and I cannot stress enough that this actually happened, they performed together at a Beverly Hills synagogue concert recorded by the BBC. Wilkermiski played clarinet while Grabowski sang an original composition called Ode to the Little Ones. Despite allegedly meeting only briefly 50 years earlier as traumatized toddlers in a death camp, Wilkermiski claimed to recognize Laura on sight. The BBC, for their part, apparently did not ask follow-up questions. Laura told them, "He's my binya, that's all I know." Two Holocaust survivors reunited after half a century, performing a clarinet and vocal duet about dead children for the BBC. Neither of them had ever been in a concentration camp. Will Komarski was exposed in 1998 as Bruno Dössecler, a Protestant Swiss Gentile who'd spent the war years in Switzerland. He insisted his memories were real and the documents must be wrong. And Laura Grabowski was exposed in 1999 as a woman named Laurel Rose Wilson, born in Tacoma, Washington in 1941, never left the United States, definitely not Jewish. The investigators who exposed her were a team from a Christian magazine called Cornerstone, and what they found when they dug into Laurel Wilson's background suggested a pattern that stretched back decades. A history of fabricated accusations, some later recanted, repeated hospitalizations, documented self-harm that left scars she would later display as evidence of Nazi medical experiments. What's striking here isn't the psychology, that's beyond my ability to diagnose and besides the point. What's striking is the system kept believing her. Two people independently fabricating Holocaust survival found each other through the trauma marketplace and collaborated on a shared false memory. The template was so legible and well established that they both made up the same exact fake injury from the same fake Mengele experiments without having ever met beforehand. Anne Rothey, in her book Popular Trauma Culture, makes an observation about what these frauds reveal. Forgeries signify which objects are considered most valuable and hence significant in a given culture. In other words, the question isn't why did these people lie? People lie for all sorts of reasons, who cares? It's the much more interesting, why did these specific lies work? What was the market selecting for? The answer certainly wasn't historical accuracy or political complexity. Sue Weiss, in her book Textual Deceptions, points out that fraudulent Holocaust testimonies tend to only focus on, quote, individual uncomprehending suffering rather than any sort of engagement with the organized and bureaucratic machinery that actually made the Holocaust so distinctive. Basically, there's an abundance of individual misery, but an absence of anything else. This is suffering that asks nothing of the reader except emotional response. In other words, audiences want the template. These four authors weren't anomalies. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, fraudulent Holocaust testimonies appeared with striking regularity, enough that scholars coined the term Will Komarski syndrome to describe the phenomenon. Rosenblatt's Angel at the Fence, scheduled for 2009, that's the apple-throwing book that we talked about in the intro, was just the most Oprah-endorsed example. There's also Rosemary Pence, Rosemary Coxey, Mary Sophie Hengst, and, if we're being generous with the definition, former Congressman George Santos. Though in his case, the fake Holocaust survivor grandparents were maybe his fifth or sixth most embarrassing lie that month. I genuinely cannot cover every case. And these literally established the moral grammar that the broader misery memoir genre would inherit. There's a particular tradition in Christian culture, especially Western Christian culture, where people consume suffering as a moral exercise. Christ on the cross, Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows, the massacre of innocents. For centuries, Christian art trained audiences to look at images of pain, feel compassion, and understand that feeling as spiritually meaningful. False Holocaust testimony adapted this tradition for the 20th century. It's worth noting here that Will Komarski was Protestant Swiss, De Fonseca was Belgian Catholic, Wilson was Protestant American. 3 of the 4 major fake Holocaust memoirists we've discussed here were Christians fabricating Jewish suffering, and you can see the through line to Christian art in them. It's not how a lot of post-Holocaust Jewish theology approaches the Shoah. Obviously, you can't completely generalize with something like this, but you're much more likely to see Jewish writers like Emil Fackenheim, Emmanuel Levinas, and Richard Rubinstein talk about things like rupture, God's absence, the failure of Theodicy, or even putting God on trial. Like, Levinas literally wrote an essay called Useless Suffering, where he argues that trying to give misery spiritual meaning is a kind of violence against the sufferer. The through line here is suffering that resists meaning rather than guarantees it. The fake memoirs, though, delivered the Holocaust as Christian audiences wanted to receive it. Suffering that meant something and that left you feeling morally improved for having witnessed it. It's The Passion. It's Mel Gibson, not Mel Brooks. Real testimony, of course, can be healing. It can be politically galvanizing. It can be essential to historical memory. The problem is the media apparatus that selects, edits, and packages certain stories in certain ways. The production choices that transform testimony into something else. And Rothy points out that when Oprah visited Auschwitz, the episode didn't provide historical context or political analysis. Instead, it used her trademark therapeutic language. The space where education or action might go was filled with inspiration. Once again, audiences were invited to feel, not to think or act. Rothy argues that the Holocaust was adopted into American national memory because it could be unethically appropriated as an exculpatory screen memory to evade responsibility for the crimes perpetrated throughout American history. Reading sad yet inspirational stories about the Holocaust lets American audiences feel virtuous without thinking about slavery or Jim Crow or America's role in the Holocaust or anything that might actually emotionally confront them. The genocide happened over there, perpetrated by them. Our role is to feel appropriately moved and say never again without having to specify what exactly we're preventing or how or whether it might be happening right now somewhere we'd rather not look. The Holocaust becomes a uniquely horrible thing that happened once to other people far away in the past rather than a warning about what is possible under specific, recognizable, repeatable conditions. The misery memoir boom inherited this worldview wholesale. There's a passage in A Child Called It where Pelzer describes his mother locking him in the bathroom with a bucket of ammonia and bleach, the fumes making him cough up blood. He writes, "I felt as if I was locked in a gas chamber." And later, "Of all mother's punishments, I hated the gas chamber game the most." Though their historical usage extends beyond the Holocaust and indeed into the States itself as recently as the 90s, for an average reader, gas chamber means one thing. It's not necessarily that the comparison is inappropriate. If you're a child being gassed by your parent, reaching for gas chamber is fair and arguably even accurate. But the choice to name it that way as an adult writing for adult readers and the choice by editors and publishers to use that framing borrows clarity and moral weight from that association. It's invoking the Holocaust as a metaphor to make personal suffering legible. It's been so thoroughly domesticated into a symbol that it becomes available as emotional shorthand. Pelzer's mother is horrible, like this other thing. And the reader gets to tap into the same emotional register. Innocent child, incomprehensible cruelty, suffering that exists outside policy or systems. This is what makes the child narrator so valuable to the industry. It's both emotionally effective and frictionless. Adult trauma narratives invite questions, fair or not. Why didn't you leave? What choices led you here? The child narrator precludes all of that. In her paper, The Pornography of Trauma, Faking Identity in Misery Memoirs, scholar Alison Miller points out the bind this creates. Child victims represent a voice that is as sacrosanct as that of the Holocaust survivor. The profound consequences of falsely doubting a child witness have ensured that reading audiences largely refrain from explicitly accusing even the most incredible misery memoirs of fraudulence, revealing tensions about the relationship between children, truth, and trauma. This is as it should be, in a sense. The alternative, subjecting every abuse survivor to prosecutorial skepticism, is worse. But it also means the genre had almost no defense against exploitation. If the child voice is sacrosanct, then anyone who can convincingly inhabit it gets access to that sacredness. At first, Misha de Fonseca wasn't questioned about wandering around Europe being saved by a pack of wolves like Mowgli because who would question a child Holocaust survivor? The same mechanics that protected real survivors from cruel skepticism also protected fabulists from better fact-checking. You believe the children, don't you? With the template established and the moral grammar in place, the market did what markets do. It scaled. The result was a flood. In the US, Julie Gregory sickened in 2004 about surviving Munchausen by proxy. Augustin Burroughs Running with Scissors in 2003. Phrase A Million Little Pieces in the same year, though it wouldn't explode until Oprah picked it up in 2005. But the UK was where things got truly industrial. Tony Maguire's Don't Tell Mummy in 2006, sexual abuse by her father. Cathy O'Byrne's Cathy's Story in 2005, abuse in Irish institutions, the truth of which is still hotly contested. Constance Briscoe's Ugly in 2006, childhood abuse so severe her mother later sued her for defamation. I should note here, Briscoe won. By 2007, The Guardian estimated that as much as 30% of the UK paperback nonfiction bestseller list in a given week consisted of what they call grinding childhood misery narratives. The pressure was always toward escalation. The Independent described it as a misery-lit arms race, houses competing for ever more sensational stories. The Guardian's John Crace put it bluntly and somewhat bitchily. Readers would no longer be fobbed off with dreary, run-of-the-mill stories of rehab and divorce. Only XXX memoirs of the extreme would now do. Get the right graphic mix, and you have a license to print money. One publisher, John Blake, would later admit that these things are generally so libelous that we tend to change the names just to avoid lawsuits. The industry knew on some level that verification was a problem. The solution was legal prophylaxis, not fact-checking. Fact-checking, after all, would have meant a lot fewer books and a lot less money. Pelzer's book became a trilogy. The Guardian's Geraldine Bedell, reviewing the later volumes, noted a definite feeling of exaggeration in the later two books. Once a trauma narrative succeeds, there's pressure to produce more. And in this genre, more means worse. The market created a monoculture. Stories that fit the template got acquired, stories that didn't got rejected. The selection was so consistent that, as we've seen, liars could study the formula and succeed, sometimes more easily than actual survivors whose experiences didn't match the template. The mass market for trauma selected for a very specific kind of narrative and trained millions of readers in a very specific way of understanding suffering. James Frey's book is almost a parody of this logic. He famously rejected 12-step programs and their religious framework, which, based, but what he replaced it with was pure individual willpower. Addiction is overcome through personal determination, not through healthcare access or through addressing the economic conditions that correlate with addiction or any systemic intervention, just choosing to be strong. This is not actually how addiction works in the vast majority of cases. I would hazard it's a little insulting to apply addiction as just like a skill issue, actually. But it's a very comforting framework for readers who don't want to think about policy, and it's also a very comforting framework for readers who want to feel proud of themselves for not using drugs. The British Social Attitudes Survey tracks public opinion on welfare over time. During the Misery Memoirs boom years, the percentage of Britons who believed benefits were too generous increased. The percentage who thought welfare recipients don't really deserve help went up. A cultural moment obsessed with stories of overcoming tragedy through personal determination coincided with a political movement increasingly hostile to structural support for vulnerable people. This is not because reading Dave Pelzer made anyone vote Tory, not any more than ice cream sales cause crime, but because both phenomena express the same underlying common sense about how the world works. Individuals succeed or fail on their own merits. Systems are backdrops, not causes. The appropriate response to suffering is sympathy for the individual, never demands on the state. A genre celebrating bootstrap resilience is not consciousness raising about poverty. 1 million people reading about a child surviving abuse through sheer will does not translate into 1 million people calling their MPs about child services funding. I cried while reading this is a different response than I'm going to fight to stop this. This wasn't a conspiracy, but look at what each part of the system was optimizing for. Publishers wanted cheap acquisitions with built-in marketing hooks. Talk shows wanted guests who could cry on camera and deliver emotional peaks every segment. Supermarkets wanted impulse purchases, which meant covers that communicated you will feel something in 2 seconds flat. And people did feel things, reading these sad child narrators whose stories fit the template and who didn't really understand what was happening to them. It's why the book sold, and it's why the genre, for all its millions of readers and billions of tears shed, seemingly produced no political movement, no policy change, and no collective response to the suffering it depicted. This is what the misery memoir machine looked like by the mid-2000s. A system that produced compelling narratives and had almost no mechanisms for distinguishing the real ones from the fake because, in a sense, the distinction didn't matter to the market. What mattered was the feeling. The formula worked for publishers and talk shows, and it worked for readers. This industry's crash was shockingly sudden, though. By 2008, the top 30 misery titles sold 35% fewer copies than the year before. And what's strange to me is that it coincided with the financial crisis, but not in the way you'd expect. These books peaked during the anticipation of collapse. 2006, 2007, when anxiety was high, but paychecks were still coming. Once actual hardship hit, readers stopped buying. Maybe the psychological function broke. When you're comfortable, reading about someone worse off provides reassurance. When you're genuinely struggling, it's just someone else's misery on top of your own.
To be clear, general book sales actually went up during this period, even with the financial crisis. The decline came a couple years later, which means there was something specific about misery memoirs that people were sick of.
The publishing industry moved on, but a formula this profitable doesn't just appear from nowhere in 1995. 2 decades earlier, a different book had pioneered this exact template with the exact same lurid first-person confession and titillating suffering packaged as warning. It sold millions of copies. It was taught in schools. Parents gave it to their children to scare them straight. And, like so much of what followed, it was fake. In 1971, a diary appeared that would change how America thought about teenagers, drugs, and authenticity itself. Go Ask Alice was marketed as the real diary of a 15-year-old girl who accidentally ingested LSD, descended into addiction and sex work, and died of an overdose. The diary itself never names the girl. The title actually comes from Jefferson Airplane's song White Rabbit. You know, technically Alice is the scientist and the girl is Alice's monster, but she's been referred to as Alice for decades, so we'll use that name for clarity. Sorry, prescriptivists. It sold over 3 million copies by 1978 and became required reading in schools across America. It was repeatedly challenged and age-restricted for being filthy smut by politicians who had never heard of the Streisand effect. Parents clutched it like a manual for understanding their terrifying children. Teenagers passed dog-eared copies between classes, either horrified or fascinated by Alice's descent. The timing was perfect. In October 1969, a woman named Diane Linkletter fell from her kitchen window and died. She was 20 years old. Her father was Art Linkletter. If you're not familiar, think of him as an early talk show host, one of the most recognizable faces on American television throughout the 50s and 60s. He'd hosted House Party for 25 years. He was a wholesome, avuncular household name, and he had an explanation for his daughter's death: LSD. Specifically, LSD flashbacks. This was a concept that dominated drug panic in the late 60s and early 70s, the idea that acid highs could spontaneously resurface days or weeks after you'd used it, sending you back into a hallucinatory state without warning. You could be doing anything, driving, holding a knife, and suddenly you'd be tripping again. The drug had permanently rewired your brain. You were never safe. This was, to be clear, not at all how LSD works, but it was what parents believed. And Art Linkletter, grieving and searching for meaning, gave that belief a face and a story. His daughter had tried LSD at some point. Months later, she fell from a window. Therefore, the acid came back and killed her. Now, there's a lot more to Diane Linkletter's story. Her brother-in-law had died just months before. By several accounts, she'd struggled for years to connect with her famous father and feel seen by him. She was dealing with things that had nothing to do with a tab of acid she'd taken at a party. But Linkletter had a platform and a simplifying, emotionally resonant narrative, and the narrative was LSD kills innocent girls. He became a spokesman for the war on drugs. Now, Linkletter would later realize he was wrong about a lot of this and relax his stance, but at the time it didn't matter. Nixon seized on stories like these for his culture war, using drug panic to criminalize black communities and anti-war protesters. The fear was racialized in ways that were sometimes explicit and sometimes just hovering at the edges. The corruptors who might dose your innocent white daughter were coded as black and as countercultural and often as queer. Go Ask Alice delivered exactly what that panic needed. Alice is white, middle class, and very sheltered. She doesn't seek out drugs, she doesn't make bad choices, she's a victim from page 1. She gets dosed at a party against her will. Someone does this to her, and once it's done, she's doomed. There's no harm reduction here or any sense of navigation or complexity. Just if drugs touch you, even without your consent, you will be destroyed. Now, a major source for this section is Rick Emerson's meticulously researched 2022 book, Unmask Alice. It's really good and I highly recommend it. So Go Ask Alice is supposedly edited by the woman who was given Alice's journal, Beatrice Sparks. And yes, I'm aware her initials are literally BS. Sparks was already an accomplished fabulist by the time she discovered Alice's diary. Born into the Church of Latter-day Saints in Idaho, Sparks had run away from home as a teenager, experienced genuine hardship. Her father abandoned the family, she lost a premature baby, her house burned down, and she had to adopt and raise her younger sibling, all in her 20s. Perhaps these early traumas taught her how suffering could be packaged and sold. By her 40s, she'd been publishing false biographical details about herself in vanity presses, claiming university degrees she didn't have. She'd worked as an advice columnist for teen magazines, writing both the questions and answers herself. The answers were incredible, by the way. A definitely real teen writes to her like, "I'm always fighting with my boyfriend," and she responds, "Have you considered it's your fault, though?" Incredible. She'd ghostwritten for the Family Achievement Institute, a multi-level marketing scheme that sold music records, which connected her to the aforementioned Art Linkletter. When she moved to Provo, Utah in her late 40s, she positioned herself as a respectable wife and youth counselor, though she had no formal counseling training. By 53, living in the heart of Mormon country as the Manson trial and Diane Linkletter's death dominated headlines, Sparks saw an opportunity. She used her connection to Linkletter to pitch a real teenage diary she originally called Buried Alive. The anti-drug establishment needed authentic voices of teenage suffering. Sparks would provide them. Here's what actually happened, according to Emerson's investigation. In summer 1970, at a BYU camp for teenagers, a girl, Emerson calls her Toby, yes, really, befriended a troubled teen named Brenda who struggled with her identity and faith. When Brenda had a breakdown the first night of camp, screaming in her dorm room, the actual counselors panicked and called in Beatrice Sparks, a woman who'd convinced everyone she was a psychologist. This was because she had experience volunteering at Utah State Hospital, where her actual duties were mending clothes and helping kids with homework. Sparks sent the other girls back to their rooms, told the counselors Brenda had unhealthy tendencies, and left. She never had a real conversation with Brenda again. Toby stayed pen pals with Brenda for a while until her parents made her stop, sending Sparks worried updates the whole time, which is how Sparks learned anything about Brenda's life at all. Years later, Sparks transformed I sort of met a troubled girl at summer camp into Alice's harrowing diary, which is where she made up the acid-laced drink, the descent into addiction, the psychiatric hospitalization, and obviously the tragic death. Brenda, the real inspiration, actually went on to succeed in college and work with at-risk teens. She's never read Go Ask Alice. So that's the raw material Sparks was working with. What she built from it became one of the most read books of the 70s. Go Ask Alice and her later books really were proto-misery memoirs that defined every aspect of the template, perhaps most importantly, the complete absence of structural analysis. When trauma memoirs exploded in the 2000s, they followed the model Sparks created. If you actually sit down and read Go Ask Alice today, you'll find it's a strange artifact. In places, it genuinely sounds like a teenage girl's diary, especially the early sections, like the mundane family dynamics and petty grievances, or the self-conscious asides.
Last night's dinner was excruciating. Alex loves her new school and her new little friend Trisha. Tim rode the bus with the neighbor boy. Mom went to a tea and found everyone charming, beautiful, and pleasant. Isn't that nice? Well, like oil and water, I can't quite adapt or fit. Every so often, I even seem to be on the outside just looking in on my own family.
That sarcastic parenthetical and the sense of alienation in your own home are actually painfully real, at least to me. Teenagers recognize that feeling. There's another passage where Alice processes her grandfather's death, spiraling from grief into wondering about resurrection and decay, ending up at, I understand so little, I don't know how I even exist. Yeah, girl, same. And this is why the book worked. Before it does anything else, it validates. It says, you feel like an outsider, you feel like your parents don't understand you, you feel like the world is confusing and dangerous and nobody's giving you a map. All of that is true. Teenagers in 1971 were navigating genuine cultural upheaval. Vietnam, the draft, the sexual revolution, parents who had no framework for what their kids were experiencing. Go Ask Alice met them where they were. But then there's the other stuff. When Alice descends into addiction, the prose shifts into something else entirely.
Another day, another blowjob. The fuzz has clamped down to the town is mother dry. If I don't give Big Ass a blow, he'll cut off my supply. The dirty Ove who wants me to lay it on him knows my ass is dragging. But he's doling out the only supply I know about.
The slang is wrong. It reads like someone learned it secondhand from a police briefing. Ofe in a white teenage girl's diary? The scenarios are cartoonish. We get a pregnant commune girl who says her baby will belong to everybody, a pre-med dropout who performs abortions, some vindictive former friends who lace her food just to destroy her recovery. It reads less like lived experience and more like a greatest hits of everything a suburban PTA parent might imagine happens at drug parties. It is easy, 50 years later, to sit back and sneer and say, how did anyone believe this? But that's not quite fair. The book wasn't popular just because readers found the blowjob monologues credible. I mean, sure, many people who were sheltered obviously did. Even at the time, though, while some news outlets were reaffirming that it was a true story, and many people did believe it was, there was still incredulity. For a lot of people, the idea was that even if the exact story wasn't true, the emotional scaffolding was credible. The alienation was real, the loneliness was real. The sense that adults had no idea what you were going through was extremely real. Some people, including notably actress Gillian Jacobs, have credited Go Ask Alice with helping them avoid addiction or process their own struggles. And look, I don't want to be dismissive of that. The book clearly did something for its readers. But also, this is how any effective messaging works. Every enduring scam, from Scientology to multi-level marketing, provides something real before it can sell you something false. If it didn't, it wouldn't be much of a scam. Like, no one joins a cult because the cult opens with, hello, we are going to ruin your life, please join us. Scientology starts with generic self-help exercises that genuinely reduce people's anxiety before introducing the alien stuff. MLMs create community and purpose before the financial exploitation kicks in. These systems work precisely because they offer real solutions to real problems, just enough to keep you believing deceiving while obscuring the deeper harm. The helpful parts are the delivery mechanism for the bad ones. Likewise, Go Ask Alice offered teenagers acknowledgement that their interior lives were complicated and painful. And then, having earned that trust, it delivered a very specific message about what the danger actually was. And it was never the loneliness, family dysfunction, lack of mental health resources, or the adults who couldn't connect with their kids. The danger was out there. Pushers, hippies, people who would dose you without your consent and drag you into hell. Go Ask Alice made Beatrice Sparks into an expert. By 1978, the book had sold over 3 million copies. She was doing interviews, claiming to counsel thousands of runaway teens, getting profiled in the New York Times. She started putting doctor in front of her name on book covers, though she had no doctorate. When a journalist named Eileen Nilsson actually investigated her credentials in '79, she found no evidence Sparks had any formal training. Sparks responded with an angry letter claiming a UCLA psychology degree she definitely did not have, then held a grudge against Nilsson for decades. But the doctor stuck. Same principle as Memoir on phrase cover, the label is capable of literally creating the authority, and desperate parents looking for someone who understood their troubled children started reaching out. One of them was a Mormon mother named Marcella Barrett, who had lost her son Alden to suicide in 1971. She'd been searching for explanations ever since. When she learned about the woman who'd been given Alice's diary, a fellow church member no less, living right there in Utah, she thought she'd found someone who could make sense of what happened to her boy. She gave Beatrice Sparks her dead son's journal. Alden Barrett was 16 when he died. He was a debate team captain, a brilliant student who loved arguing ideas, a kid with what we'd now call big feelings. He'd grown up in strict Mormon culture in Utah, and everything about him seemed to clash with what was expected. He grew his hair to his shoulders in an era where that alone marked you as rebellious. He openly questioned the church's racism. He fell in love with classical music and philosophy. He struggled with abusing prescription pills and seemingly didn't have anyone to talk to about why. He was, by all accounts, a sensitive, intelligent teenager trying to figure out who he was in a world that demanded conformity. The more I read about Barrett in Emerson's book, the more upset I got. This was a kid who got placed in the wrong family, in the wrong community, at the wrong time. Everything about him suggested he needed space to figure out who he was, and everything about his environment demanded conformity and silent obedience. His parents responded to his questioning with escalating authoritarianism. When his behavior worried them, they forcibly cut his hair while his siblings held him down. They took away everything he owned, his books, his record, even his bed and the clothing he had been wearing, and locked him in an empty room for 3 days with nothing but a pen and paper, demanding he write essays about what a terrible person he was. They couldn't tolerate who their son was becoming, so they tried to unmake him. They sent him to what we now call troubled teen industry facilities. First, a notoriously awful one, then to a more stock standard boarding school that he didn't mind so much. When he came back still questioning church doctrine, still himself, and wanted to go back to boarding school and be with his friends, they refused to send him back. For a few days, he ran away to San Francisco. It was 1970, and that city represented everything his parents feared. The draft loomed. When he came home, he wanted to get clean and started keeping a careful journal documenting his thoughts. Then he met a girl named Teresa, an upperclassman at his school. They fell in love with the intensity only teenagers can manage, the kind where the other person becomes the entire world and you do anything to protect what you have because everything else keeps getting taken away. But both sets of parents opposed the relationship. When Teresa's parents forbade them from seeing each other, they snuck into their school gym one night and held a symbolic wedding ceremony. Just the two of them in the dark. 2 kids playing at permanence in an impermanent world, trying to make something that couldn't be taken from them. Teresa's parents found out. They forced her to break up with Alden and start dating her ex-boyfriend as a compromise. The world was systematically removing everything that made life bearable for Alden. His friend Renee killed herself in December 1970. His childhood dog died. His psychiatrist kept telling his parents he wasn't really depressed and didn't need help. Imagine the betrayal of even your therapist denying your reality. Every institution that should have helped him was instead tightening the vice. In January 1971, Alden took his own life. He was 16. In his note, he apologized to his parents and to Teresa. Even in the end, he was thinking about other people's feelings. If Alden had survived, he would have turned 18 just as the draft was winding down. He was terrified of being sent to war, and he would have missed it. He would have aged out. All of the things crushing him were temporary. He just needed to outlast them. He couldn't know that. None of us can know that when we're in it. And now I have to tell you what Beatrice Sparks did with his story. Jay's journal was published in 1978. It became a bestseller. It was taught in schools alongside Go Ask Alice. It was cited by police officers and FBI agents as evidence that satanic cults were recruiting American teenagers. Why satanic cults, you ask? Because Beatrice Sparks turned Alden's life and death into a pulp novel about devil worship. The book opens with Alden, who she's renamed Jay, as a normal kid, then charts his descent into witchcraft. Ouija boards, seances, animal sacrifice, drinking blood, seeing demons. By the end, Satan has claimed his soul. Take the midnight wedding. She read Alden's real journal and read about two teenagers in love sneaking into their school gym to hold a symbolic ceremony. It's the most teenage thing imaginable. Dramatic, romantic, a little silly, completely harmless. It's sweet. And she moved the setting from a school gymnasium to a graveyard. It's now a ritual satanic initiation instead of a wedding. Jay and his girlfriend slice their tongues and taste each other's blood to seal their union. Then they sacrifice a cat. The most tender thing in Alden Barrett's short life became evidence of satanic initiation. His interest in philosophy became him studying the Satanic Bible. His depression became demonic possession. She invented scenes of him drinking cow's blood, seeing demons in his room, participating in ritualistic murders. Two of his real friends were written into the book and killed off. And she barely disguised any of these real-life details, by the way. Neil became Niels. A school dance called Sweater Swing became Sweater Fling. The Barrett family was easily identifiable to anyone in the area. Anyone could figure out who this family was. Alden's siblings were still in high school. They got harassed. His gravestone was vandalized repeatedly. At one point, someone stole it entirely. Eventually, Marcella Barrett had it taken down. When she confronted Sparks about the book, Sparks claimed the book was actually a composite of 3 journals. She brought copies of positive reviews to the meeting, as if good press justified the destruction of a dead boy's memory. She'd later claimed during a press tour that editing the witchcraft material had caused her physical pain from psychic warfare. My sympathy for Alden's parents is mixed. Emerson's book hedges on this a bit too much for my comfort, but I feel quite confident in stating they abused him. They couldn't accept who their son was, and their inability to accept him contributed to his death. Where I do sympathize is how they were exploited by Sparks. Here, they were grieving parents who gave their son's journal to someone they thought would help them understand, someone who presented herself as an expert, a fellow church member, a person who'd been given another dead child's diary and turned it into something meaningful. And Sparks took their grief and their trust and their dead son's private words and turned them into a lie that made memory and destroyed what was left of the family. Jay's journal has now existed for nearly 50 years. That's 3 times longer than Alden Barrett's entire life. The hyperreal signifier has utterly consumed the signified. For about 15 years, I've been following and spending time on online communities like r/troubled teens dedicated to exposing what's called the troubled teen industry. These are facilities, therapeutic boarding schools, wilderness programs, where parents can pay to have their children removed from their homes and transported to unregulated programs, often across state lines. The industry is worth billions of dollars. In Utah particularly, lax oversight and the religious community's emphasis on parental obedience made these facilities thrive. Kids have died there, exposed to temperatures that killed them, left to die after medical emergencies, suffocated, beaten to death by staff. Survivors have repeatedly reported PTSD lasting decades. Paris Hilton is among the more famous ones. At 14, I guess the right word is scam bait these places. I'd pretend to be a concerned parent, email admissions offices, get into long conversational threads with them just to waste their time. This is a real exchange I had with a facility called Horizon Academy. I told them my son wasn't willing to attend. I named him Dean because, well, Their response, "We don't recommend you tell him until he is here and in a safe place. That is when he will have support from other positive peers." A safe place. Positive peers, that's the language they use for taking a child from their bed in the middle of the night without warning. Within the survivor community, there's a word for this, gooning. I know that word means something very different on the internet now, but way before it meant anything else, it referred and still refers to the strangers, often large men, who show up at 3 a.m., physically restrain a sleeping teenager, and transport them to a facility before they even understand what's happening. They can be handcuffed, zip-tied, blindfolded, or hooded. It meant parents paying strangers to kidnap their own children. Here in Canada, this is barely taken seriously. While the US has at least started tracking deaths at these programs, Canada hasn't even gotten that far. No records are kept, we don't know how many kids have died because no one's counting. In 2023, Radio Canada released a report about a faith-based treatment centre in Hearst, Ontario, where 40 people, most of them minors, were sexually abused over the course of 6 decades. Some of the children sent there were told the only alternative was prison. In most American states, too, this is completely legal. There's barely any regulation at all. A handful of states have started to address it. Oregon regulates transport companies, Maryland just passed a law banning blindfolds and nighttime pickups, but the patchwork is thin. Utah, which is the epicenter of the industry and receives about a third of all teens sent across state lines for treatment, now requires transport companies to register with the state and undergo background checks. I want to sit with that for a second. The reform, the progressive step forward, is that the people you hire to kidnap your children have to register with the government and prove they don't have a history of abusing children so that they can be allowed to abuse your child. Depending on your perspective, regulations like these either protect kids from the worst abuses or they reify child abduction as a legitimate service, just one that needs proper licensing. Maybe they do both simultaneously. If that framework sounds familiar to both my American and Canadian audience, strangers entering a home, violently removing someone in the middle of the night, and the reform conversation focusing on how to do it more humanely rather than whether it should happen at all, it should. In many ways, we've been here before. In many ways, we're still there. The Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act was signed into federal law in December 2024 after years of advocacy from survivors, including Paris Hilton. It's a start. It requires studies and reporting on the industry. It doesn't ban goons kidnapping children. The entire legal architecture that makes this possible rests on the concept of parental rights. Parents can consent on behalf of their children to horrific things those children would never consent to themselves. If a stranger grabbed a sleeping adult, handcuffed them, and forced them into a vehicle, that's kidnapping. Unless it's a cop or you get it. A stranger doing the exact same thing to a teenager with parental permission is a service you can find through a Google search. The child's rights don't exist independently of the parent's authority to override them. Provo Canyon School is one of the most notorious of these facilities. It's still open. In July 2024, a staff member received probation for assaulting a child there. And the reason I'm mentioning any of this at all is that Beatrice Sparks lived 400 meters away from Provo Canyon School. 400 meters. She would have driven past it regularly. She probably knew parents who sent their children there. The Barretts sent their youngest son to Provo Canyon after Alden's death. Beatrice Sparks never said a word about what was happening behind those walls. Instead, she invented demons. And it would be an understatement to simply claim she was failing to expose the troubled teen industry. She was in fact actively reinforcing the ideological framework that makes it possible. Look at what Jay's journal tells parents. Your child isn't suffering because of anything you did. Your child is being seduced by external and demonic forces. The solution isn't to give your child more autonomy or more room to figure out who they are. The solution is to tighten your grip. More surveillance and control. Take away their books, cut their hair, lock them in a room until they write essays about what a terrible person they are. Send them somewhere that will fix them. Sparks turned a boy who was killed by authoritarian parenting into a cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient authoritarian parenting. She sold grieving parents like Marcella Barrett a story that absolved them and blamed demons at best or their dead children at worst. The formula actively reverses the causation. The abuse becomes the cure, the poison becomes the prescription, and the people who destroy their children get to feel like heroes for doing it. The same year Jay's journal hit shelves, teachers in Provo, Sparks' own town, were fielding protests and phone calls demanding they stop running Dungeons & Dragons at after-school programs. The game was a gateway to Satan worship, parents insisted. Kids were learning spells, real ones. In August 1980, a gifted Michigan State student named James Dallas Egbert III attempted suicide and disappeared. He played D&D. A private detective hired to find him decided the game was responsible. The theory was that Egbert had gotten lost in the steam tunnels beneath the university while acting out a game scenario. It made national news. When Egbert eventually took his own life the following year, several newspapers, mostly Canadian for some reason, reprinted a fabricated quote about giving Satan his mind and power. Patricia Pulling founded Bad, bothered about Dungeons & Dragons after her son's death. A TV movie called Mazes and Monsters dramatized the danger. Yes, that's Tom Hanks. These panics fed each other, and when police departments and FBI field offices started getting calls about ritual crime, they needed experts to make sense of it. They found Jay's journal. By 1985, Sandy Gallant of the SFPD was speaking at Quantico, training federal agents to recognize signs of satanic cult activity. Many of these seminars cited Sparks' book as evidence. The same year, the Daily Herald ran a piece called Satan Worship in Zion, full of unverified stories about local devil worshippers. The final page featured the story of Alden Barrett, 14 years dead and still being used as a cautionary tale about Satanism. Sparks kept publishing. In 1993, she released It Happened to Nancy, supposedly the diary of an AIDS patient. She invented a doctor to endorse it. She wrote herself into the narrative as Dr. B, the heroic therapist saving troubled teens. The license she'd always wanted, finally granted by her own imagination. 4 more books followed that decade, each featuring Dr. B as the wise counselor, each based on real diaries that somehow all sounded exactly like Beatrice Sparks. She would die rich at age 95 in 2012. Meanwhile, something else was building.
This is Jefferson Elementary School, where everything appears normal. But across this community, parents are asking a difficult question. Is Satan enrolling your children into his army? And if so, is he using the buddy system? I'm 400 feet away from where learning happens. I wasn't allowed any closer. I'm told this is normal and how restraining orders work. But inside infiltrators managed to smuggle me this heavy metal cassette found in a locker at this very school. When played backward, you can hear the phrase, which could either mean Satan is Lord or syrup on board. Either way, concerning. When we asked local children if they'd ever participated in satanic rituals, 73% said no, but 27% said, what? Which is exactly what you would say if you were being brainwashed. This has been Brenda Trenderbrand for WARN Evening News. More at 11, if there is an 11.
Between 1983 and 1995, thousands of Americans became convinced that a secret network of satanic cults had infiltrated the nation's daycares and schools. These cults were allegedly abusing children in elaborate rituals involving animal sacrifice, blood drinking, and sometimes murder. Children were supposedly programmed to forget, and their memories were buried so deep that only specialized therapy could retrieve them. None of it was real. There was no network, there were no cults. The physical evidence that investigators kept promising would surface, like the sacrificed animals and ritual implements, never materialized. What did materialize were destroyed lives, teachers imprisoned for decades, families bankrupted by legal fees, and children subjected to interrogations so coercive they constitute their own form of abuse. Between 1950 and 1980, the Rust Belt's share of American jobs declined by 28%. Manufacturing employment fell by over a third. Cities like Dayton lost 15,000 manufacturing jobs. Ohio would eventually lose 402,000 over the next few decades. Then came Reaganomics. The richest 1%'s share of national wealth nearly doubled, while stable factory jobs gave way to precarious service work. Meanwhile, white families were fleeing cities for suburbs at unprecedented rates. Researcher Leah Booston found that for every black family moving into a central city, 2 white families moved out. The suburbs these families landed in were anxious places, communities built on the promise of safety and stability, watching that promise erode. Researcher T.J. Brooks analyzed the satanic ritual abuse cases and found that both the accusers and the accused were almost entirely white. Conservative Christians in suburbs, small towns, and rural areas were the demographics most likely to buy in. This was overwhelmingly a suburban white phenomenon. Brooks argues there's a reason the panic didn't need to target communities of color. Other mechanisms were already in place to do that work. Why accuse a black man of being a Satanist when you could more easily accuse him of being a gangster? What we did see, however, was a class angle. At the same time, middle-class women entered the workforce in massive numbers, which meant children needed to go somewhere during the day. Daycare enrollment exploded. For the first time, millions of relatively well-off parents were handing their children to strangers, often working-class strangers who they didn't fully trust, for 8 hours a day, and coming home to ask, "What did you do today?" and getting the fragmentary, nonsensical answers small children give. These parents needed a story, an explanation for why everything felt so precarious. They needed a villain who wasn't the economy or the collapse of a single-income household or any of the structural forces actually reshaping their lives. They would get Satan. The reason they were able to get Satan started a few years earlier, actually. In 1973, a book called Sybil became a publishing phenomenon. It told the story of a woman with 16 separate personalities, the result of horrific childhood abuse by her mother, abuse so severe her mind had shattered into fragments to survive it. The book sold millions of copies. It was adapted into a TV movie. It single-handedly created public awareness of what was then called multiple personality disorder. It was also, as we know now, largely fabricated. The real woman behind Sybil was Shirley Mason. Her psychiatrist, Cornelia Wilbur, became convinced Mason had repressed memories of abuse and used hypnosis and heavy sedation, sometimes drugging her patient to get her alters to speak, to extract increasingly lurid stories over more than a decade. The abuse Wilbur helped Mason remember included her mother organizing lesbian orgies in the woods, demonic rituals, things that never left any evidence or witnesses. Years later, Mason wrote Wilbur a letter. She admitted she didn't actually have multiple personalities, she'd been performing, trying to give her therapist what she seemed to want, and it had spiraled out of control. She wanted to stop. Wilbur's response was essentially, take it back or I'm done with you. By that point, Mason's entire life revolved around these therapy sessions. Wilbur was her whole world. So Mason recanted her recantation. She said an alter must have written the letter. She went back to seeing Dr. Wilbur 5 times a week. The book stayed in print. This established a template of its own. A vulnerable patient, a therapist convinced of buried trauma, memories recovered through hypnosis or drugs, accusations that grew more spectacular over time, and a publishing industry eager to package the results. It also established something more insidious, the idea that memories could be so deeply repressed that the conscious mind had no access to them whatsoever, that the absence of memory wasn't evidence nothing happened, but evidence that something so terrible happened that the mind had to hide it from itself. Before we go further, I need to establish something about the therapeutic techniques you're going to see. In the 1980s, the science on memory wasn't fully settled. These were genuine debates. But these debates are over now, and the verdict is clear. Recovered memory therapy is scientifically completely discredited. What we now understand about how memory works is that when people talk about repressed memories, they're imagining something like a filing cabinet. The memory is in there somewhere, locked away, and therapy is the key that opens the drawer. But that's not how memory works. Memory is reconstructive. There is no pristine original sitting in storage. Every time you remember something, your brain rebuilds that memory from scratch, using fragments, context, current beliefs, and suggestions from your environment. The memory you have today is not a recording of the event, it's your latest reconstruction of it. That means that repeatedly recovering the same memory under therapeutic guidance doesn't excavate a buried truth. In fact, it is incapable of excavating a buried truth because there is none. Instead, it potentially corrupts whatever fragments existed by incorporating the therapist's suggestions into each new reconstruction. Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most influential experts on memory of the 20th century, demonstrated across hundreds of experiments that essentially false memories can be implanted. About a quarter of her subjects developed detailed memories of childhood events, being lost in malls, attacked by animals, like the animal who keeps meowing right now, memories that never happened and that their families confirmed never happened. And not just vague impressions either. People added sensory details, emotional responses, and when told the memories were false, some insisted that they were real. The most troubling finding was that false memories feel identical to real ones. They activate the same neural pathways. The person genuinely believes them. Again, hyperreality. The authentic supersedes the true. Getting lost in a mall is what childhood trademark feels like, and thus it is childhood. When researchers study documented trauma survivors, they find those survivors remember. Gallier Yehuda and colleagues found that Holocaust survivors with PTSD showed worse general memory than non-PTSD survivors, but when trauma-related words were introduced, their recall sharpened. Trauma-related cues acted as memory amplifiers, and the more severe their intrusive symptoms, the stronger this effect. Rather than locking trauma away, the brain is actually building an increasingly elaborate network of associations around it. Exposed to genuine, overwhelming horror, the brain replays it intrusively for decades. Dissociation during trauma is real, of course, but that doesn't mean the memory gets locked away for later accurate recovery. If anything, it tends to produce intrusive memories. The therapeutic practice of recovering memories through suggestive techniques literally cannot tap into some dissociated storage unit. It creates false memories because the storage unit model itself is wrong. By 1997, every major psychological and psychiatric organization in the English-speaking world had issued formal warnings against recovered memory techniques. So when you watch everything that happens next, understand that we now know this approach is literally not capable of revealing hidden truths. Nevertheless, This is the framework that Sybil presents to the audience as true, and it is a framework that will prove incredibly useful to a bunch of grifters and politicians very shortly. 7 years later, in 1980, a Canadian psychiatrist named Lauren Stratford published Michelle Remembers, co-authored with his patient Michelle Smith. Like Sybil, it presented itself as a true case study, this time about Satanism. Smith claims she'd been ritually abused by a secret cult throughout her childhood in 1950s Victoria, BC. The memories had been buried for decades until Pelzer helped her recover them through hypnosis, over 600 hours of sessions, which should perhaps have raised some questions about what exactly was being constructed in that room. The book is structured as Pelzer observing Michelle during these sessions, narrating her recovered memories as they emerge. It's framed as medical documentation. At one point, Michelle remembers being trapped in a car with a corpse. The car crashes. The body's head spun freely around, all the way around, as if the vertebrae were shattered, the face suddenly stopping inches from the child's. Its eyes were rolled up into the head. Michelle screams, "Make it go away! Make it go away! It's a mess! The head's a mess! Make those crazy eyes go away!" At another point, her voice changes during a session. Pelzer notes that pretty delicate Michelle, by the way, ew, started speaking in a deeper voice. The words came extremely slowly, in a thudding, monotonous cadence. And then the voice, which apparently is literally Satan, begins to recite poetry. It's like 7 pages of poetry. Satan starts monologuing in rhyme about his master plan.
First cut away the feet. Make a man feel incomplete. Lose his footing. Lose his ground. Lose the way to walk around. Pretty soon you have no knees. Then you can't bend, can't say please.
There's a footnote on page 284 clarifying that part of the poem, the satanic method of counting is inclusive, so what commonly would be 27 years is 28 years by their reckoning. The book wants you to know it's being rigorous about satanic numerology. At the climax, the Virgin Mary personally intervenes to save Michelle. This is presented as fact in a medical case study written by a licensed psychiatrist. The book became a bestseller. Meanwhile, Beatrice Sparks's Jay's Journal was still circulating, teaching police officers and parents that Satan was recruiting teenagers through rock music and role-playing games. A fiction book by a woman with fake credentials and some Satan poetry by a therapist who would later divorce his wife to marry his patient became the evidentiary foundation for what would come next. The template was set. All it needed was a place to detonate. In the summer of 1983, in the wealthy Los Angeles suburb of Manhattan Beach, a woman named Judy Johnson told police that her 2-year-old son had been molested at his daycare. The daycare was called McMartin Preschool.
My name is Judy Johnson, and I want to report a crime. Yes, ma'am. My 2-year-old son has been molested at the McMartin Preschool.
Now, much of what I'm about to describe with the McMartin case is documented in Richard Beck's 2015 book, We Believe the Children, and Debbie Nathan and Michael Snedlicker's 1995 book, Satan's Silence. Both were major sources of research for me, and I recommend both. We Believe the Children specifically had a lot of related cases about police misconduct that didn't quite fit into the scope of this video, but you should read it if you want to be very angry. McMartin Preschool had operated in Manhattan Beach since 1966. It was, by all accounts, one of the most respected daycares in the area. Virginia McMartin had founded it. Her daughter Peggy ran the day-to-day operations. Peggy's son Ray Bucky worked there too. Judy Johnson had never actually formally enrolled her son. She just left him at the facility one day, and Virginia McMartin, being the kind of person she was, had let him stay. This detail matters for understanding what came next. In August 1983, Johnson told police her son had been abused by Bucky. Her evidence was that her son said his bottom was itchy and that he'd been playing doctor, a game she decided he'd learned from Bucky. She filed a police report, Bucky was arrested, and then the Manhattan Beach Police Department did something extraordinary. They sent a letter to approximately 200 families whose children attended or had attended McMartin. The letter informed parents that Bucky had been arrested for suspected child abuse and asked them to question their children about whether they had witnessed or experienced this. The letter told parents what to look for before they looked. It primed them with specific allegations. And when parents dutifully sat their children down and asked if any of these things had happened, the children said no. The parents did not believe them. After all, believing the children takes priority over silly things like believing any particular children. One mother, Ruth Owen, asked her daughter Nina whether kids at McMartin were ever made to take their clothes off. Nina said no. Ruth told the police she thought her daughter was lying. Another parent became concerned when her child had a UTI, even though the doctor wasn't worried. By September, the accusations had spread. The stories grew stranger. Children were being taken off campus to be abused, parents heard. There were secret tunnels under the school. Teachers wore masks and robes. Animals were sacrificed. Some children, who were being asked the same questions over and over again, said they'd been flushed down toilets into secret rooms. One child described being thrown from a boat into a school of sharks. Another mentioned a goat man. No tunnels were ever found. No animal remains. The school was a modest single-story building on a residential street. But the absence of evidence was just interpreted as evidence of how sophisticated the conspiracy was. Of course there was no proof. These people were professionals. Meanwhile, Judy Johnson's accusations were escalating. By October, she was telling police her son had been dunked into a toilet, that Ray wore a mask and cape, that he dressed as a minister. By November, she was describing staples, severed heads, black candles, drinking blood, a lion. Johnson would later be diagnosed with severe mental illness. She appeared to have been genuinely suffering and would eventually pass away from medical complications in 1986. But by then, her initial accusations had become a national phenomenon. The Los Angeles district attorney at the time was Robert Philipposian, running for re-election and trailing in the polls. McMartin became his cause. He opened a formal investigation and hired a social worker named Key McFarland to interview the children. Key McFarland had worked with Lawrence Pasder, aka the psychiatrist behind Michelle Remembers. She was trained in the same framework of recovered memories and buried trauma. And when she sat down with the McMartin children, she had a job to do.
We have heard it 100 times or more from children. The same things, the same games, the same descriptions.
The interview transcripts are public records. I want you to hear how these conversations actually went. McFarland interviews a young girl about Ray Bucky. The girl's response isn't, "I saw," it's, "My mom said." Quote, because sometimes my ma said sometimes he tied up kids. The girl repeatedly clarifies she didn't see this herself, she's just repeating what her mother told her. McFarland pushes. When children say nothing happens, she tells them their friends already confided in her. Quote, "Other kids remember things, and they told me you were there. So don't you remember seeing some of that?" The child shakes her head no. McFarland's response, "You're just afraid." The child says she isn't. "You're just a scaredy cat. How come you won't tell me?" With a boy named Keith, McFarland asks, "Are you smart or are you dumb?" When Keith insists he remembers clearly and nothing happens, she responds, "Well, what good are you? You must be dumb." Keith holds firm for a while. Then finally he relents and says maybe something happened because his parents told him so. Another investigator, Lou Fonieris, questions a child who repeatedly insists his teacher never hurt him. He said he likes her. He says he's sad she's in jail. Fonieris tells him all his friends already said something happened. "You don't want to be left out, do you?" And to another reluctant child, "I don't want to hear any more no's." And every little boy and girl in the whole school got touched like that. These are the techniques that produce the testimony. Children who said nothing happened were told they were stupid, or that their friends had already talked, or that they were being left out, or that their memories were simply wrong. They were interviewed repeatedly, sometimes for hours, until they produced the answers adults wanted to hear. Believe the children, right? You'll note, by the way, that adults telling children, "I don't want to hear you say no," and "you don't want to be left out," and "you're smart, aren't you?" and essentially "do what I say or else," literally mirrors grooming rhetoric. They were, in fact, the ones priming children to be groomed by adults. And these kids were often traumatized by these interviews themselves, as well as by invasive medical exams they were made to undergo to prove the McMartin associations. One passage from Satan's Silence describes a child who was interviewed by Key McFarland and had been acting normally until CII interviewers diagnosed her as a victim and suggested that she enter therapy. She did, and within weeks, she was worried about her parents dying. In a few months, Tanya was obsessed with deaths, funerals, and cemeteries. Then she began playing games in which she was pregnant and Ray Bucky was slaughtering her babies. After these investigations, another child, as Debbie Nathan put it, was having frightening dreams about guns, knives, skeletons, and dismembered bodies. He abandoned his bed and started sleeping in a cardboard box. Much like the troubled teen industry and what we'd see with Jay's journal, these people were literally abusing children under the guise of protecting them from abuse. The accusations didn't stay in Manhattan Beach. In Jordan, Minnesota, 24 people were charged. In Bakersfield, California, children described being hung from hooks on the ceiling. In Miami, Frank and Ileana Fuster were convicted based on recovered memories extracted from Ileana after she was isolated and pressured until she confessed. She's tried to recant ever since. In Maplewood, New Jersey, a daycare worker named Kelly Michaels was prosecuted. The fact that she'd had relationships with women in college was used against her at trial. In Massachusetts, a gay daycare worker named Bernard Barron was prosecuted. The prosecutor told the jury that putting a gay man in a daycare was like putting a chocoholic in a chocolate store. Barron was sentenced to 3 life terms. He was 18 years old. Here's what makes that case particularly awful. One of the children who testified against Barron had actually told investigators it was his mother's boyfriend who hurt him. He wasn't believed. The boyfriend was never charged. Barron spent over 20 years in prison before his conviction was finally overturned. Believe the children. This happened repeatedly. All the panic did was make children less safe. When every accusation involves secret tunnels and baby sacrifice, the ordinary reality of abuse, which usually happens at home with family members, becomes harder to see. The fantastical stories created noise that drowned out real signals. Plus, obviously, school abuse is actually more likely to happen when daycares are underfunded and can't vet people, or when children are taught adult authority is absolute and you should do whatever an adult tells you, which ironically is exactly what the satanic panic was exacerbating by reinforcing parental control and using adult authority to bully kids into testimony and demanding more obedience from children. Cool. In 1985, Key McFarland testified before the United States Congress. She told them under oath that preschools across America had become fronts for organized abuse rings. This was presented as expert testimony. It shaped federal policy. The FBI was getting flooded with calls. Kenneth Lanning, an agent in the behavioral science unit, organized a 4-day seminar to try to make sense of it all. People showed up with lists of hundreds of supposedly occult organizations. An SFPD officer named Sandy Gallant distributed checklists of ritual indicators, things like jewelry, swords, robes, chanting. This was being handed out at the FBI as investigative guidance.
So what you're doing is when you come onto a scene and you're investigating a scene, you look on the ground and you'll find clues as to what happened. What we have here is a medicine bottle of 2% xylocaine. And of course, if you're going to ritually sacrifice an animal or a human for that matter in a public place, you don't want them to be screaming in pain. So it's not uncommon for occultists to use something like this, and of course, here we have it.
Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit.
The next victim might show up tomorrow on the beat. It could be in your community, or it could be in a major city or a small rural area. Could be a member of your family. Could be someone you know. I challenge you to investigate each crime just a little bit deeper. Let's stop this heinous crime that's going on in the name of the devil.
A case in Washington state shows how far the recovered memory framework could go. Paul Ingram was a sheriff's deputy, a man who believed in the system. His daughter came home from a Christian summer camp convinced she'd repressed memories of abuse. When confronted, Ingram didn't deny it. He couldn't remember doing anything, but maybe he'd repressed it too. He started working with hypnotists and pastors. Under their guidance, he began to remember both abuse and being part of a satanic cult. He confessed to rituals and murders, including the Green River killings, an actual unsolved case. He kept confessing to things that made less and less sense. A psychologist named Richard Offshee was brought in to evaluate him. Offshee suspected the confessions were fake, so he ran a test. He fabricated an allegation, something completely made up, never claimed by anyone, and presented it to Ingram as real. You remember doing this, right? Within hours, Ingram had a detailed memory of the event. He could describe it vividly. When Offshee told him he'd invented the whole thing, Ingram insisted the memory was real. He knew it had happened. Ingram pleaded guilty. He served 20 years. These were the consequences of the recovered memory hoax and, to some extent, Jay's journal. By the time McMartin went to trial, it had become the longest and most expensive criminal case in American history. The preliminary hearing alone lasted 17 months. Some defendants spent 2 years in jail before seeing a courtroom. One prosecutor quietly left after developing doubts about the case. He would later say that everything they investigated revealed nothing. They watched the family's home movies. They were a normal family. He said they kept expecting real evidence to surface eventually. It never did. And in the middle of all this, one lawyer decided to make it his personal mission to be as annoying as humanly possible. Danny Davis was Ray Bucky's defense attorney, and he was, how do I put it, a particular kind of guy. When he was in law school and won a mock trial competition, his professor reportedly told him, "There's something wrong with you. You won, but we don't like you. And when you go out into the real world, other judges aren't going to like you either." It's unclear whether Davis took this as an insult or a mission statement.
And he gets to be a lawyer? What a sick joke!
His strategy was simple. Slow everything down, make the prosecution regret ever filing charges, and be as relentlessly theatrical as the situation required. He understood the social panic was at its peak, and a verdict coming early would be really bad. He needed to let the air out of the balloon. So he dragged out every proceeding, filed every motion, objected to everything objectionable, and several things that weren't.
There are attorneys that are called obstructionists. They try to obstruct the process. I think Danny enjoyed doing that.
My plan was to take the scandal and the scapegoat and spread the time. And then we all look back with shameful retrospect what we did to those poor people. That's why we had a very, very long preliminary hearing, the longest in the history of American jurisprudence.
At one point, he showed a child witness a series of photographs and asked if he recognized anyone. The child said, yes, those were the Satanists. One photo was of Los Angeles City Attorney and future Mayor James Hahn. The other was Chuck Norris. Davis moved to subpoena Chuck Norris. The message was clear: either admit this child's testimony is unreliable, or put Chuck Norris on the stand to deny being a Satanist. Your call. His greatest move came near the end. By then, the McMartin building had sat empty for years. Davis bought it. He personally purchased the daycare, then he restored it to look exactly as it had when the school was operating and brought the jury there for a tour. He had them walk through the rooms. He had them see how small the building was, how thin the walls were, how close together everything was. He had them make noise to hear how sound carried. Secret tunnels? Where? Ritual rooms? In this little building on a residential street? Screaming children that no parent or neighbor ever heard? 6 days. He spent 6 days on his closing argument alone. On the first day of his closing, Davis reportedly gestured to 2 massive briefcases and said, "They're not full of lunch," which is legalese for settle in, I'm gonna be insufferable, and I'm gonna be thorough, and you're gonna sit here for all of it. And indeed they had to. Beck's book mentioned he brought in a surrealist painting at some point during his closing argument. The book doesn't say which painting or why. I suspect that's because nobody knew why. His law professor was wrong. I like this guy very, very, very much. Meanwhile, Peggy Ann Bucky went on television to call the whole thing a witch hunt. An audience member shouted back, "That's right, we're looking for witches, aren't we?"
Oh my God, he admitted it!
And while the trial ground on, the panic was metastasizing through American media. In October 1988, Geraldo Rivera aired a 2-hour primetime special about the subject. 20 million households tuned in. It featured law enforcement officials, concerned parents, and, I need you to sit with this, Charles Manson, presented as an authority on satanic influence. The special treated satanic ritual abuse as established fact. The only question was how widespread.
Whatever the connection, there is no doubt that teenage satanic activity in this country is increasing dramatically.
Parents were given lists of warning signs: heavy metal albums, Dungeons & Dragons, black clothing, an interest in fantasy literature. If your child liked the wrong things, Satan might already have his hooks in. Bob Curry appeared. He was a McMartin parent who'd been organizing vigilante investigations, posting license plates, interrogating random pilots, comparing the daycare to Auschwitz, and eventually bringing a gun everywhere he went. He was presented as a parent spokesperson, insisting the satanic elements of McMartin were being downplayed.
The truth about Satanism is they truly do use blood, and they mix it with urine, and then they also use the real meat, the real flesh. This is what makes Satanism true, and it's an outrage that we are where we are with this case and these poor unprotected kids.
There was an epidemic. It was everywhere. The preschools were just the beginning. The special's title was Exposing Satan's Underground. That phrase, Satan's Underground, was also the title of a book published that same year, a memoir, a survivor's testimony. The author was a woman named Lauren Stratford. Stratford's book described a childhood of almost incomprehensible horror. She claims she'd been made to participate in rituals, forced to breed babies that were then sacrificed. The abuse had been so severe, she said, that she'd repressed the memories for decades until therapy helped her recover them. She had scars on her body. She showed them to audiences. Evidence, she said, of ritual torture. She appeared on talk shows to share her testimony. She went on Oprah. She became one of the most visible faces of the satanic ritual abuse survivor movement.
I will probably have nightmares tonight about it.
as I have about my Joey that I have been talking about. I wake up screaming for him now in the middle of the night.
The end result of almost any satanic ritual is sex. Perverted sexual orgies. When babies are about to be sacrificed, or when there is a sacrifice to be made, sometimes a light has shone, just miraculously, has shone in the middle of the ritual. The rituals are always performed in darkness, then recognized it as the light of God. And they close up shop.
Her book was sold in Christian bookstores across America. She spoke at conferences. She was cited as proof this nightmare was real and survivors were finally coming forward. The truth could no longer be denied. Her story was horrifying. Her pain seemed genuine. Her scars were definitely real. And her real name was Laurel Rose Wilson. Laurel Rose Wilson, the fake Holocaust survivor, the woman who showed up in 1997 claiming to be a Mengele victim, the woman who performed a clarinet duet with another fake survivor for the BBC. That woman's real name was Laurel Rose Wilson. It's the same person. Lauren Stratford is Laura Grabowski. In 1988, she went on Oprah and showed audiences scars from satanic ritual torture, and in 1997, she showed Holocaust survivors the same scars and said they were from Nazi medical experiments. The same scars. She just looked at her body and said, these are from Satanists for one decade, and these are from Mengele for the next decade, and both times people believed her, and both times she collected money, and both times she appeared on television as a survivor, and both times it took years for anyone to figure out she was lying. 2 years later, Cornerstone Magazine, a Christian publication people who wanted to believe her, investigated Lauren Stratford and exposed her as a fraud. They found a pattern of fabricated accusations stretching back to her teenage years. The scars were real, the stories were not. You may remember they're the same magazine who would later also report she wasn't Laura Grabowski. The same people had to expose the same woman twice, a decade apart, for two completely different fake backstories. So Lauren Stratford disappeared from the satanic ritual abuse circuit, and 7 years later, Laurel Rose Wilson walked into a Holocaust survivors group in Los Angeles with a new name and the same scars, and did it again. One woman, two completely different apocalypses, the same formula every time because it was the template again. On May 1st, 1989, an Oprah episode titled Mexican Satanic Cult Murders featured a segment with a woman using the pseudonym Rachel. She appeared in disguise and told Oprah her Jewish family had practiced satanic rituals going back to the 1700s.
Does everyone else think it's a nice Jewish family? From the outside, you appear to be a nice Jewish girl?
Definitely.
And you all are worshiping the devil inside the home?
Right. There's other Jewish families across the country. It's not just my own family.
Really?
I've blocked out a lot of the memories I had because of my multiple personality disorder. There would be rituals in which babies would be sacrificed, and you would have to, you know...
Whose babies?
There were people who bred babies in our family.
20 million households were watching. Rachel was later identified as Vicky Polan, a Chicago woman who'd been undergoing, you guessed it, recovered memory therapy. Julius Streicher was executed at Nuremberg in 1946, in part for publishing blood libel in Der Stürmer. And here it was on daytime television in 1989, dressed up in therapeutic language. Polan may genuinely believe what she said. Recovered memory therapy was producing these narratives across the country since the techniques themselves generated the content. If you search for this Oprah clip today, you'll find it on explicitly anti-Semitic websites. The Satanic Panic may have been discredited years down the line, but it still generated content that would be weaponized for decades. In January 1990, after 6 years and $15 million, the McMartin jury returned its verdict. On 52 counts, not guilty. On 13 counts against Ray Buckey, deadlocked. Peggy McMartin Buckey was fully acquitted. Ray was released on bail after 5 years in prison awaiting trial. When interviewed after, jurors pointed to the interview tapes as a reason they couldn't convict. They watched those recordings, the ones that hadn't been destroyed or lost, and they couldn't tell whether children were describing things they'd actually experienced or things adults had pressured them to say. Here's a detail from Satan's Silence that I can't stop thinking about. In cases where interview recordings were made, preserved, and given to the defense, juries often acquitted. In cases where there were no tapes, defendants were typically convicted. At some point, investigators realized this. They stopped recording the interviews. Kenneth Lanning, the FBI agent who'd been fielding satanic ritual abuse calls since 1983, released a report in 1992. He'd spent nearly a decade investigating these claims, he'd attended the seminars, reviewed the cases, followed every lead. His conclusion was that he had found no evidence, none, of organized satanic cults ritually abusing children anywhere in America. Some people accused him of being a Satanist plant. Convictions started getting overturned. Children grew into adults and recanted. In 2005, the LA Times interviewed Kyle Zerpolo, one of the former McMartin children, for a piece just called "I'm Sorry." He said the same thing so many others eventually said. He was hounded and pressured. He made things up because adults wouldn't stop until he did. The interviews themselves, he said, were the traumatizing thing. Kyle says,
I remember telling them nothing happened to me. I remember them almost giggling and laughing, saying, "Oh, we know these things happened to you. Why don't you just go ahead and tell us? Use these dolls if you're scared." Anytime I would give them an answer that they didn't like, they would ask again and encourage me to give them the answer they were looking for. It was really obvious what they wanted. I know the types of language they used on me, things like, I was smart, or I could help the other kids who were scared.
Some of the wrongly accused eventually got justice. Many didn't. Bernard Barron, the gay teenager sentenced to 3 life terms, didn't get his conviction overturned until 2009. He died a few years later. Some defendants are still classified as sex offenders. Some lost their homes paying legal fees. Some lost decades. And then no one made anything up about daycares ever again. As for the therapists and the investigators, many of them are still working or happily retired and treated as authorities. Justice never really came for them, and at least throughout the 80s, nobody built a better childcare system or addressed the economic conditions that made parents desperate and anxious. The panic consumed all that energy and directed it at demons, and when the demons turned out not to exist, everyone just moved on. In this case, many readers, and as we saw with Wilson, many scammers, specifically moved on to the misery-lit industry.
James Frey made it big from immeasurable suffering, a close loved one who dies, and ultimately recovery through sheer will. Lauren Stratford made it big from immeasurable suffering, a close loved one who dies, who in this case was literally her baby who she says got sacrificed, and ultimately recovery through faith. Go Ask Alice and A Child Called It both have a child narrator escalating horrors and individual ontologically evil villains. Michelle Remembers has a child narrator escalating horrors and the individual ontologically evil villain. He has both of the most fundamentally evil traits known to man. He's Satan, and worse, he wants you to listen to his mediocre poetry. The truth is, abuse is often mundane rather than spectacular, and it typically also doesn't follow a clean narrative arc.
Sometimes people don't process, say, sexual abuse as traumatic in the moment and only realize what was done to them was wrong years later. There's often no redemption moments. There's rarely a single villain who explains everything. Sometimes there's no ending. When real survivors enter this marketplace, some don't get published at all because their experiences aren't shaped right. The abuse was too banal or too systemic or too ambivalent. They loved the person who hurt them. They still struggle. Their story doesn't end with triumph. Editors pass. Some get published but get either luridly embellished or sanded down. The complicated parts get smoothed over, the ambivalence gets cut, the systemic stuff disappears in revision. What remains is a clean arc. Suffering, then survival, then inspiration. The book that emerges fits the template even if the life didn't. Look at Herman Rosenblatt, an angel at the fence from the beginning of the video. Rosenblatt survived the Holocaust. That was his real story. And someone, at some point in the chain between experience and publication, made the calculation that the real story was insufficient. Someone decided the reality of the camps, which involves a great deal of tedium alongside the brutality, long stretches of nothing punctuated by horror, was less sellable than a fairy tale about girls throwing apples over a fence. His actual life was worth less than the embellishments. That's the market working exactly as designed. And some, the grifters, fit the template perfectly from the start. These are people who had read the books and watched the talk shows. They knew a misery memoir needed a scene where the narrator almost dies. They knew it needed an identifiable villain. They knew it needed a moment of triumph. They could construct the perfect trauma narrative precisely because they weren't constrained by the mess of actual experience. Meanwhile, real survivors were either rejected for not fitting the mold or edited until they did. The template became so rigid and specific in its demands that invention was often easier than truth. The market created conditions where fabrication had a competitive advantage. This is the machine, and it's so much bigger than misery memoirs. Literary scholar Sue Weiss, comparing misery memoirs, notes something strange. 2 books, Constance Briscoe's Ugly and Kathy O'Byrne's Don't Ever Tell. One vindicated in court as factually accurate, the other widely questioned. Structurally, they're almost identical. Both use child narrators, both escalate through specific beats of suffering,
and both end with lists of support organizations like Childline and the Residential Institutions Redress Board, with the idea being that the reader might finish the book and realize, oh, this happened to me too.
The elements of Authenticity's construction remain the same whether the text is reliable or not.
Those resource lists are simultaneously there to help readers and to bolster the book itself.
They signal, this is real, this could be you. The author survived, and survivors don't lie. This genre makes a promise, what theorist Philippe Lejeune called the autobiographical pact. The narrator and the author are the same person. What you're reading actually happened. Your emotional investment is warranted because the suffering is real. The moment that promise exists, so does the possibility of breaking it. The misery memoir presents an author. The survivor's existence, meaning their body, their interviews, their appearance on fucking Oprah, become what Anne Rothy calls an epitext, something outside the text that authenticates what's inside. You're reading words on a page, but far more importantly, you're witnessing a person who lived this. This is why the hoaxes feel like such betrayals. The lie is embodied and parasocially intimate. The author made a promise with their presence. The book was almost secondary. Consider influencer culture, the industrialization of the autobiographical pact. The entire economy of social media runs on performed authenticity. Creators build audiences through the promise that what you're seeing is real, unfiltered, genuinely them. Their lives become content. Their trauma, too, becomes content. We consume people. The author as epitext has become the default mode of online existence. The creators who succeed are the ones who most convincingly perform authenticity, which turns out to be a skill that can be learned or faked. A fabricated story that hits the right beats outperforms a true story that doesn't. In 2013, Belle Gibson's wellness app had 200,000 downloads in its first month. She'd survived terminal brain cancer, she said, through clean eating and positive thinking. Penguin published her cookbook. She promised to donate proceeds to charity. The story was perfect. Diagnosis, transformation, hope you could buy for $24.99. It was also completely fabricated. She never had cancer. When the lie collapsed in 2015, she faced fines she still hasn't fully paid. No criminal charges. 2 years later, Chrissy Teigen posted photos from the hospital after losing a pregnancy. In many circles of the internet, she was eviscerated. Performative, attention-seeking, who takes photos during the worst moment of their life? But her entire career was documentation. The platform incentivizes influencers to share everything. When real grief arrived, it could only take the form the template allows, and then that form made it appear suspect. And this is, of course, the same selection pressure that the publishing industry democratized and accelerated. Real survivors shape their stories into algorithm-friendly forms. Fabulists study what works and reverse engineer it. The platform can't tell the difference. Often the audience can't either. The machine teaches this lesson early. Every year, millions of 17-year-olds sit down to write university admissions essays and discover what committees want. Trauma. The right kind, though. Trauma that demonstrates resilience and ends with growth. Trauma that proves you're a productive, healed person who deserves a spot without requiring institutional support once you arrive. The template is rigid. You need adversity, but not ongoing, not the kind that might affect your GPA. You need to have overcome it through personal will and grit, whatever bootstrapping narrative makes the committee feel good about meritocracy. Package your worst experiences into 800 words that reassure a stranger you've processed everything neatly. If your trauma is messier than that, or if the thing that would help is structural support rather than a good attitude, you learn to sand it down until it fits. Or you lie, or you don't get in. Your suffering is only legible when it's shaped correctly. Learn this at 17. Carry it forward. The template scales up to geopolitics. When North Korean defectors arrive in South Korea, they enter a system with specific constraints. These are people with real trauma. You do not leave your entire country behind, your family, everything you've known without that. But the system they enter shapes what stories they're able to tell. First, we have the legal constraints. South Korea's National Security Act makes it illegal to express anything positive about the North, to even possess books with similar views for that matter. In 2023, a 68-year-old man named Lee Yeon-sup was sentenced to 14 months in prison for writing a poem suggesting reunification might provide free housing and healthcare. Defectors who become South Korean citizens cannot legally travel back. They cannot tell complicated stories about missing aspects of home, like a favorite teacher, a childhood friend, or a food they love that isn't widely available in a different country without risking prosecution. The UN Human Rights Committee has repeatedly criticized the law's chilling effect. Then there's economic precarity. Most defectors arrive with nothing. They need income, they need to survive. And the market has opinions about what kind of survival story sells. A 2015 Guardian investigation that looked into why so many of these stories fall apart found that cash payments for defector interviews had become standard practice, starting around $30 in the late 90s, rising up to $200 per hour by 2014, sometimes up to $500 depending on the quality of information. The more shocking, exclusive, or emotional the story, the higher the fee. This creates direct financial incentive to exaggerate. Defectors themselves have described this pressure. As The Guardian put it, quote, An Myung-chul, a former prison guard at Camp 22, said people liked shocking stories and these so-called defector activists were merely responding to this desire. Chung Kwang-il, a former prisoner at Camp 15, said the fame brought by media exposure trapped them, forcing them to reproduce a certain narrative. Audiences want spectacular horror, cartoonish evil, narrow escapes. Once again, they're looking for the template, and that same market pressures that forced misery memoirs to get increasingly bloody do the same for defector testimonies. A Washington Post investigation described the booming market for horror stories from the cloistered nation that encourages some defectors to spin increasingly outlandish claims. Shin Dong-hyuk, author of Escape from Camp 14, eventually admitted he'd fabricated key parts of his memoir, for instance. The extreme end of this is someone like Yeonmi Park, who I would call just an actual straight-up con artist. She's the one who goes on podcasts claiming that North Korea doesn't have a word for love and that citizens have to push the country's one train because there's no electricity.
There's no word for love in North Korea. There's no word for liberty. There is no word for human rights.
I mean, she also said she was mugged by a bunch of black women in New York, and when she tried to call the police, a bunch of random people surrounded her and started punching her and calling her a racist, so, I mean...
Were refusing to help me, and not only that, they were screaming at me and calling me a racist. I have almost white privilege, and therefore I cannot be a victim, even though I am being victimized by these black women punching me and taking my wallet away. I have no right to defend myself, and I cannot even call the police on these criminals. I mean, our vice president keep talking about equity all the time. It's evil.
And they were all wearing t-shirts that said, "Down with cis." But focusing on the outright liars and grifters misses the point. Most defectors aren't career fabulists. They're people with legitimate trauma navigating a system that rewards certain stories and punishes others. And yet, even in an ecosystem filled with people who have legitimately been through horrible shit, you start to see a propensity of stories that don't add up, that, much like the misery memoirs, begin to prioritize being cinematic over anything else. A defector who says, life was hard but complicated, I miss my family, the food situation was bad, but I also had a job and friends and a normal human experience, that person doesn't get the book deal or the speaking tour, doesn't become useful to foreign policy, and also could literally go to jail. We lose the texture of real people's real experiences, and we get, instead, the stories that serve functions having nothing to do with the people telling them. Forces at every level, legal, economic, social, market, constrain what kinds of stories even legitimately traumatized people can tell. The messier truths become unspeakable. What remains is what the machine can use. But why is this the template? Across decades and genres and completely different cultural contexts, spectacular suffering, individual villain, redemptive arc, often child narrator if possible, the same structure keeps winning. The template persists because it does something for the people consuming it. The hoaxes are the clearest evidence of what that something is. When a con artist succeeds, they're showing us exactly what audiences were willing to believe. They reverse engineer our desires and feed them back to us. In 1994, a white Australian man named Leon Carman published a novel under the name Wanda Coolmatry, claiming to be an Aboriginal woman. My Own Sweet Time won awards. Critics celebrated it as an authentic Indigenous voice. When the hoax was exposed, people asked how this could have happened. Look at what the market was asking for. It wanted white people's idea of Aboriginal stories, authentic voices, trauma filtered through an exoticized other. Carman studied what was being rewarded and delivered it. His actual identity was irrelevant. He understood the assignment better than the market understood itself. The same pattern appears wherever Western audiences want to consume the suffering of people who aren't them. Remember Norma Corey, the forbidden love author from earlier, the honor killing that never happened, the best friend who never existed, when in real life it was written by a real estate scammer who hadn't lived in Jordan since she was 3? Yeah, her book sold over 200,000 copies, and now we can see why. She was giving Western audiences exactly what they already believed about Muslim women and Muslim fathers. The story didn't need to be true, it just needed to fit. In 1992, Jean Sasson published Princess, a true story of life behind the veil in Saudi Arabia, supposedly the legitimate secret diaries of a Saudi princess named Sultana Al Saud, who she'd somehow managed to get in contact with. It was all about honor killings, child marriage, women drowned in swimming pools by their families or locked in lightless, windowless rooms until they die. The book sold millions of copies across 6 sequels. It was named as one of the 500 great books by women in the book 500 Great Books by Women. It hit the New York Times bestseller list. Reader's Digest made it a selection. Dr. Jack Shaheen, an expert on Arab stereotyping and the author of the excellent book Real Bad Arabs about racism in the film industry, submitted a sworn affidavit calling it absolutely pure fiction. He noticed that, among other red flags, the book claims Saudi royal women underwent female circumcision, a practice that has never been part of Saudi culture, and references an Egyptian female imam, which is not a thing. It's like referencing a female pope. The book read like a checklist of every Orientalist horror story, geographically scrambled and dumped into one convenient princess's life. Sasson's previous book, of Kuwait, was part of the largest foreign-funded PR campaign ever aimed at American public opinion. The book was stuffed into media kits by Hill & Knowlton, then the world's largest PR firm, working on behalf of the Kuwaiti government. The Kuwaiti embassy bought 200,000 copies to distribute free to American troops. Note that Hill & Knowlton is the same PR firm that famously coached a 15-year-old ambassador's daughter into giving false testimony in front of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus about babies being killed by Iraqi soldiers in Kuwaiti hospitals. Doctors later confirmed it didn't happen. But the story was repeated by Bush, cited in Senate debates, and used to authorize the Gulf War. The war killed an estimated 100,000 people in 6 weeks, overwhelmingly Iraqi. The trauma narrative served as war propaganda. The narrative template selects for exactly the kind of spectacular, unverifiable claims that are easiest to fabricate and hardest to question without looking like you don't care about victims. This is what the template can do when it scales. But the princess books kept selling because they confirmed exactly what Western readers already believed about Muslim women. Meanwhile, real Saudi women like Loujain al-Hathloul really have risked everything to fight these systems. She was arrested, held in solitary confinement, reportedly tortured, and she did it to fight for specific legal reforms. But that's not the story that sold millions of copies. The story that sold was a cartoon of a geographically confused evil written by an American propagandist. Al-Hathloul's story is political. It implicates, for instance, Western governments who sell arms to Saudi Arabia and stay quiet about repression. It asks something of you. Princess Sultana asks nothing. You just get to be horrified about foreign barbarism and feel superior and then close the book. These books succeed because they're giving audiences what they already wanted to believe. The exotic other suffering in ways that confirm our assumptions. The Muslim world as a place of backward barbarism that has nothing to do with us. Indigenous communities as repositories of authentic pain. Marginalized people are tools or props through which majority groups can feel. The stories purely reinforce existing narratives while letting readers feel virtuous for caring. Now, in all 3 cases here, these stories were also completely bunk, just straight up outright lies. But this also holds even when the stories themselves are true, because there are still choices being made with regards to which stories readers even get access to in the first place. Look at the UK misery memoir boom specifically. Those painful live sections of Waterstones were overwhelmingly set on council estates and orphanages and foster homes in the industrial north. Working class misery packaged for middle class consumption. There's an entire cottage industry in British media of what you might call gawking at the pores. Benefit Street is maybe one of the most famous examples. This was a 2014 docuseries about a Birmingham street where allegedly 95% of residents were on benefits.
On James Turner Street, there is money to be earned, if you bend the rules.
As soon as I seen nothing bad, I knew it.
It was all about these people drug dealing, shoplifting, addicted, and/or openly discussing how to game the benefits system. 4.3 million viewers, hundreds of complaints to Ofcom. The Birmingham Mail later reported that the actual benefit fraud prosecutions in the city represented 0.5% of claimants, but you wouldn't know that from watching. And when the BBC went back 10 years later to interview residents, one of them said something that stuck with me. He'd been working nights during filming, and when a friend of his who also had a job was interviewed, they edited him out. He didn't fit the story. I guess a person on Benefit Street with a job was a continuity error. That's how the template works. It selects for certain stories while actively removing contradictory evidence. The misery memoir was the literary wing of the same impulse. You get to peer into lives you'd never live, feel moved by suffering you'll never experience, and close the book without having to think about housing policy or austerity or why any of this is happening in the first place. Authenticity is constructed. The construction follows rules. The rules can be learned, replicated, and above all else, exploited. Laurel Rose Wilson understood this better than anyone. She rode the satanic panic. She rode the Holocaust memoir boom. She would have ridden whatever came after if she'd lived long enough. The formula was infinitely portable because the formula was her. So what do we do? I want to be honest, I don't have a perfectly satisfying answer. And I think that's worth saying out loud because a satisfying answer is exactly what the machine produces. Catharsis, redemption, here are 5 things you can do right now, share this video. That feeling of resolution where you've understood the problem and therefore somehow resolved it is the template applied to the video essay itself. I'd rather leave you uncomfortable than perform the thing I've spent an hour criticizing. We've spent this entire video talking about fakes. Fake memoirs, fake diaries, fake Holocaust testimonies. And the instinct, the natural response, is to sort the stories into real and not real in order to debunk the liars and defend the genuine survivors. But that sorting is itself part of the trap because the template doesn't care whether a story is true. It processes real experiences and fabrications through the same machinery and generates the same product out the other end. The desire to witness suffering isn't inherently pathological. People want to understand pain they haven't experienced. They want to feel connected to lives outside their own. They want evidence that the worst things can be survived. These are real needs. Dave Pelzer's story is real, and it's his, and he can tell it however he wants. But 3 million copies of that story in a market that rejected everything that didn't look like it is something different. That's a monoculture. And a monoculture does political work regardless of whether any individual story inside it is true or false. Either way, it simplifies complex but solvable problems and makes audiences feel sad or virtuous without demanding action. Publishers, talk shows, algorithms, admissions committees, and foreign policy apparatus all independently converge on the template because they're each optimizing for something, be it sales or ideological utility. The true stories and the fake ones teach the same lesson because the lessons were coming from the selection process and not the stories. And the selection process has changed. When this video started, the template was maintained by gatekeepers, that is to say, publishers with the individual discretion to reject a million little pieces 17 times until someone slapped memoir on the cover, editors who decided which stories fit the painful lives shelf, talk show producers who chose which survivors got the couch and the camera and the crying audience, Oprah. The machinery was institutional. It had names and addresses, and you could, in theory, hold it accountable. That's largely over now. The same formula that publishers once enforced through acquisition meetings and marketing budgets now reproduces itself through recommendation algorithms and engagement metrics and the aggregate of millions of individual clicks. Nobody is deciding that trauma stories should fit the template. The system selects for them automatically because they generate engagement, because they're optimized for emotional response. Because the same features that made A Child Called It a bestseller in 1995 make a TikTok go viral in 2026. The template doesn't need publishers anymore. It's self-sustaining. The audience has internalized the formula so thoroughly that they enforce it themselves through rewarding stories that match, scrolling past stories that don't, and tearing apart anyone whose grief or trauma or survival doesn't look the way they've been trained to expect it to look. You can't fact-check your way out of this. This also means that the question was never really which of these stories are real. The question is who is showing them to you and why, and what they need you to feel and what they need you to not think about while you're feeling it. I said I don't have a satisfying answer, but I can tell you what refusing the template looks like in practice. The next time someone tells us about a heroic individual overcoming impossible odds, we can ask ourselves what systems failed, what should have caught this before heroism was necessary. After all, the troubled teen industry is still running. Provo Canyon School, where Beatrice Sparks' neighbors sent their children and where the Barretts sent their youngest son after Alden died, is still open. Kids are still being transported in the middle of the night. The legal architecture that makes it possible is mostly intact. And survivors have been organizing for years anyway. Paris Hilton testified before Congress. The Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act passed in December 2024. State legislatures are starting to pay attention. It's not enough, it's nowhere near enough, but it's happening. The story implicates parents, legislators, workers, judges, and sometimes medical professionals, and the entire framework of parental rights. It's not cathartic. It's uncomfortable. It asks things of you. They organized anyway. I'm not saying this to tell you to go join an advocacy group, though if you want to, Breaking Code Silence is a good place to start. I'm saying it because it's evidence that the alternative exists. There are ways to talk about trauma that center systems instead of individuals and demand policy instead of just tears. That's one example of many. Journalists who investigate the economics of trauma publishing rather than just profiling survivors. Researchers who study how admissions essays train teenagers to commodify their worst experiences. Activists who push back on defector narratives being weaponized for foreign policy goals. People doing the slow, unglamorous work of questioning which stories get told and why. If you want to know what's actually happening in the troubled teen industry, listen to the people organizing to shut it down, not the ones packaging it for Netflix. If you want to understand addiction, the people dealing with addiction and working in harm reduction have more to tell you than any best-selling memoir. If you want to know what housing insecurity does, ask the people on the street before you ask the people filming it. The information is there, it's just shaped for the people living it, which means it's harder to find and less satisfying to encounter, and it'll probably ask you to do something annoying like show up to a zoning meeting. That's the trade-off. The template offers you a good cry, and the alternative offers you a to-do list. It's less moving, it's more useful, and nobody has to be extraordinary for it to work. I've been sitting with this question, who decides which stories survive and in what shape, for longer than this video. My video, 3 Dead Girls I Love, is where it went. It's my favorite thing I've ever made, and it's hard to describe without giving it away, but it's about the women history kept just enough of to make you feel the loss of everything else. Their deaths are documented in granular detail, their lives are mostly silence. It starts with a recipe. 3 Dead Girls I Love is exclusively on Nebula, where all my videos live ad-free and new ones go up early. Nebula is a streaming service where I get to make things like this that are longer, stranger, without an algorithm deciding whether the subject is too niche. It's also just a genuinely great place to spend time. Lindsay Ellis publishes her video essays exclusively there. My friend Maggie Mae Fish made Amy's Dead End Dream House for it, a surreal comedy series about a woman whose household appliances are sentient and whose microwave at one point gets red-pilled. And if you want something completely different, Jet Lag is a travel competition show where the format reinvents itself every season, and the chaos is entirely the point. Also, Tom Scott is coming back to Nebula after 2 years of absence with a series where he visits every county in England, and I cannot wait for it. With my link, you get 50% off an annual subscription. That's $30 for a whole year or $2.50 a month. Go to go.nebula.tv/SarahZ or scan the QR code on screen. I really think you'll love it.
On top of a big thank you to all my patrons, I'd like to give a special thank you to my $20 plus patrons. 124MM10, Jack Heydrich, James Dugan, OpenAI Delenda Est, and Zach Radley. Thank you so much.
Thank you.